Welcome to this long-planned event. It was originally intended to be an 100th birthday celebration of John Pocock. Sadly, that is not to be, but I think it's still going to be a celebration of a remarkable life. One of the earliest remarkable moments in this remarkable life was when John was aged 4 and went to primary school, and on the first day he found the present indicative tense already marked out, chalked out on the blackboard in New Zealand. It was, of course, in Latin, amor massimat, and so forth. We've got a number of VIPs here. Welcome in particular to the principal, Sally Mapstone, who I have to say has been very generous in supporting this event. Thank you so much, Sally. Now, John Pocock was a giant in the history of historiography, in the history of political thought, in intellectual history more generally, but also beyond those rarefied realms, also in the history of these 4 nations in these islands, or perhaps it's 5 nations. I never know where the Ulster Protestants fit in. And as we'll also hear later, John also contributed to the historiography of his own native New Zealand. As I say, we've got a number of distinguished guests, and I'd like to hand over, possibly to the most distinguished of all, the Vice-Chancellor of Durham, Karen O'Brien.
Thank you, Colin. It's such a privilege to be here. John Pocock is someone I met when I was a graduate student, and my last encounter with him was when Brian Young and I were editing the Cambridge Companion to Gibbon, and he obliged us by condensing the whole of barbarism and religion into a 10,000-word essay, and it was elegantly written. Brian's nodding, needed no editing, and it just goes to show that he could be voluminous and extensive and profoundly scholarly, but he could also be incredibly succinct and extremely generous with his time and his ideas. So it's just my role in this first session to chair. I'm going to introduce our speakers sequentially, so I'll come up each time and try and keep everybody to time, and we'll have a short amount of time for questions. So our next needs no introduction, but I'll of course introduce him, Professor Colin Kidd, OBE, FBA. Colin is a Professor of History here at St Andrews, of course, and also a Quondam Fellow of All Souls, a regular contributor to the LRB, and a historian whose breadth of understanding of the genesis of historical identities of England, Scotland, Ireland and America is truly something that pays tribute to John's own broad interests. So I'm looking forward to hearing from Colin.
Thank you, Karen. This is what I'm doing this morning. A semi-neglected concept in early modern political thought. And I think I prepared this talk before I knew that the entire master's class in legal and constitutional studies was coming, and especially that Professor Hudson would be in the audience. Anyway, this is John's first work based on his PhD thesis, and it's a fascinating study of the interplay between ancient constitutional ideas and new forms of feudalist scholarship that provided arguments for late 17th century royalists. Now, I think Jamie mentioned Karl Popper, and I think one of John's great party pieces was about Karl Popper's time in New Zealand, where I think before it became the University of Canterbury, it was Canterbury College, and where John's father, Greville Pocock, who was quite conservative, nonetheless, when the newly appointed professor of Greek at the University of Sydney, who later became a prominent UK politician, came to visit. Even John's rather conservative father was utterly appalled by this figure, obviously Enoch, the young Enoch Powell. And the reason I mentioned Popper is that Popper's The Poverty of Historicism, which had been published in slightly different form earlier, appeared as a book in 1957, the same year as John's Ancient Constitution of Feudal Law. And Arthur Koestler, perhaps with a certain lack of prophecy, predicted that it was probably the only book published this year which will outlive the century. And for those interested, that's Lionel Robbins, the brother of Caroline Robbins' presentation copy of the book. Now, what I'm not going to talk about is the ancient constitution. I think the ancient constitutional element in John's book has become a kind of a ubiquitous term of art in history and history of political thought. Rumour has it that George Buchanan, The Ancient Scottish Constitution by Hugh Trevor Roper is one of Professor Mason's favourites. Or perhaps not. But, I mean, another superb example of this is by the British historian of India, Robert Travers, who looked at the interplay of attitudes to two different layers of ancient constitution in 18th century British India. But I think the feudal law or feudalism has had less traction. And of course, apart from those of you who are doing the Masters in Legal and Constitutional, most of us, I guess, when we hear feudalism, we think of oppression or vassal states and so on. I mean, it all has these negative associations. But I think, obviously, feudalism has multiple meanings. I mean, the ones that spring to mind most obviously are the socio-economic, military, the legal. But I think if we see things through early modern eyes, which is what we're going to try and do today, we see both fragmented authority and feudalism, or kings, barons, courts, and so forth, providing the origins of constitutional forms. Now, feudalism is not something that we tend to associate with the early modern period, but and this is where I'm out on a limb with the medieval historiography. There's a joke, I think it's a joke, Maitland, saying now we're an examiner to ask who introduced the feudal system into England. One very good answer would be Henry Spelman, the early 17th century antiquary. And this joke, I think, has, I mean, I'm ignorant. I'm assuming the expected answer is William the Conqueror or something like that. But the joke is here that it's some kind of antiquarian concoction or confection rather than a medieval reality. And we see something similar in Eric Hobsbawm's work, where he talks about the extent to which sort of feudal ideas were developed and were reified in the Scottish Enlightenment under the influence of Montesquieu. But in the world of medievalists, we see I think it's a return to these Maitlandite or ist ideas. We see this sort of a critique of feudalism as a construct that doesn't quite match the complexity of medieval realities. And then Elizabeth Brown's work is followed up by Susan Reynolds' book Fiefs and Vassals, where she says fiefs and vassalage are post-medieval constructs. It's a framework of interpretation devised in the 16th century and elaborated in the 17th and 18th. And she says that actually it's got as much to do with the early modern world as it has with the Middle Ages, and that there's a diversity of custom in the Middle Ages, and also other, as it were, non-feudal things like kinship and ownership and so on, and powerful states are also seen then. And so there's a process of reification, and so that feudalism or feudal law, feudal system are ideas developed in the early modern period. I'm not sure that us early modernists have quite grasped the appropriateness of feudalism to our period. I don't think we've engaged with the medievalists here. And then there's, I guess, there's the issue of, when does feudalism come to an end? Maybe it's with the abolition of warholding in England. The 1290 was put in at the very last minute for Professor Hudson. I mean, whether quia emptores actually ends a strictly feudal system in England, but as you can see, it continued in other places until later. And I remember the commutation of feu duty when my parents were bought out their feu in 1974. So, what about feudalism and early modern political thought? I'm going to trace its influence in 4 different areas. Now, the first one is the most obvious, the extent to which there's a sort of an anti-feudalist critique at work, particularly in the 18th century. And there's a superb book by a forgotten figure, John Mackrell, who was at Glasgow, I think back in the 60s, who has this superb book on the physiocratic critique, various other writers like Bonsurf, Simon Lange, and so on, and then, of course, the process culminating with the abolition of feudalism in the early stages of the Revolution. And we see something similar, though not culminating in a revolution, in 18th century Scotland, the extent to which anti-feudalism is tied in with a movement of agrarian patriotism and improvement. And there's quite a lot of discussion of feudal themes, feudal superiority, baronial courts and so forth, as well as Scots talesies, our term for entails in the Scottish Enlightenment. And most recently, Tom Pye, who I think is in the audience somewhere, has just done a Cambridge PhD dealing with Scottish anti-feudalism in the 18th century. And we can see it too in the early stages of the American Revolution, though curiously John Adams' critique of feudal law has been sort of reinterpreted. Once Adams' ideas developed in the decades following, Eric Nelson at Harvard has argued that actually this Pocock's Brady thesis, the Brady thesis of late 17th century royalism using feudalist argument, that reappears in the later stages of the American Revolution. I mean, Eric Nelson, by the way, has written very controversially on how far royalist arguments from England were part of the discourse of the American revolutions, particularly in the later phases of the revolution. Now, social theory, I think, is very important. This includes historiographical ideas. I guess the classic work here, which I think is to some extent inspired by John Pocock's work, because John, as well as writing about 17th century England, writes quite a bit about 16th century French feudalist ideas in the ancient constitution and the feudal law. And you see a very sophisticated form of historiography developing in 16th century France, fusing comparative law and philology and so forth. And this continues, I mean, after the era of Ottman in the 16th century into the 18th century. And it's the debate between Boulainvilliers, the promoter of the Frankish ideas, and the Abbé Dubois that influences the work of Montesquieu, who was intervening in that debate. By and large, though, I think the feudal law has been a relatively neglected feature of the European Enlightenment, and as we'll see later, some works have have looked at the extent to which European institutions have to be understood as a sort of Roman Gothic hybrid. And I guess one historian who did see the potential here, admittedly, I mean, as far as I know, I mean, I haven't read his Italian work, but very influential article on the 18th century debates and feudalism in the work of Franco Venturi. Others will know, I mean, John Robertson in particular, will know more about Venturi's interests here. And then there's Montesquieu. I mean, when you first come across Montesquieu's De l'Esprit de la Loi, you come across these sort of bizarre, there's some highly technical chapters on feudal law and vassalage, very, very technical, and yet one wonders what they're doing there, whether there's a greater importance given to feudal institutions in Montesquieu. Is it feudalism that makes Europe, and Europe unlike Asiatic despotism? One wonders. And I say Mackrell noticed here it's discussions of feudalism that lead into a science of society in 18th century France. And yeah, I mean, another appraisal. I don't know if Richard Fisher from CUP was involved in publication of this, but a fascinating book that hasn't had as much attention. But it shows how the royalist Brady thesis actually becomes part of a more sophisticated Whig interpretation of English institutions. And Francis Stoughton Sullivan is an Anglo-Irishman, a professor at Trinity College Dublin, and here's an example from his work of the extent to which feudalism moves from being something barbaric and oppressive, becomes modulated, becomes the basis of a more refined system of government. And of course, there are links with historical sociology, as it were, the variations in the feudal forms found across Europe leave the potential in 18th century historiography for Anglo-Scottish comparisons, for more general pan-European work, and as we'll see later, for something a little more global across Eurasia. And also there's some linkage between the conjectural method in the historical work of the Scottish Enlightenment and accounts of how feudal landholding went from something that was temporary to life-based to becoming hereditary and so forth. And I think there are close affinities between the feudalist scholarship and the conjectural method. And it was a party piece too of Walter Scott, who delivered a paper as well, an anti-diffusionist, anti-Lombardist sort of interpretation of the origins of the feudal law. So it's still a big deal, a major theme at the end of the 18th century. Less predictably, perhaps, we see feudalism having some relationship with the world of international relations. And those of you here who've been in my classes know that, rarely does a class go by when I don't make some jibe about IR. And what I see here is that the jus gentium, the law of nations, is interpenetrated with the jus feudali, the feudal law in the early modern period. And here, my inspiration is the late William Ferguson, born in the same year as John Pocock. He's a hero of mine. I have to say, it wasn't a two-way kind of. It wasn't a two-way love-in, and that's enshrined in print, I think. But his superb article in Imperial Crowns explores the extent to which the Anglo-Scottish Union debates of the 1690s and 1700s involved debates about dominium directum, as it were, a kind of as it were, feudal superiority, suzerainty in this case, and dominium utile, which is effectively ownership, but could also be understood as sovereignty, but with some feudal superior. And Ferguson's work, it was very, very stimulating. And a key figure here, one noticed by John Pocock in the Ancient Constitution, was Thomas Craig, whose manuscript treatise De Hominio, on the homage given to kings, was published in the run-up to the Union debates of the 1690s and 1700s. And I mean, IR people talk about this Westphalia system, but I have to say I'm not compelled by this notion of the emergence of modern sovereign nationhood in the Peace of Westphalia. I see something much closer to feudalism, and some figures in the historiography like Croxton and Osiander have noticed that the IR people haven't quite parsed Westphalia properly, and the two main treaties here, the one with Sweden, as you can see, it involves fiefs, it involves feudal relationships between the Crown of Sweden and the Holy Roman Emperor, and similarly the peace with France. It's got this. I mean, there's this sort of it's a barely understood. I mean, it seems almost contradictory provision in Westphalia, where these Alsatian towns are transferred to France, but they still enjoy immediacy. And this whole language of immediacy or mediatization and so forth, that these are feudal languages, and I think you can't quite explain what's going on here without some reference to the feudal law. There's Richard Whatmore's edition of Vattel's Law of Nations. This issue appears in contemporary law of nations, and also in this is a more obscure figure, Robert Plumer Ward, but he writes quite a bit about the problems in understanding the law of nations are complicated by these issues of vassalage-style relationships involving otherwise sovereign rulers. And then, finally, there's making sense of institutions outside Europe. And this is something that Craig himself noticed. He saw the similarity between Turkish timariots and feudal tenures. This again was something noted by John Pocock. And when John I don't know if John remembers this, when John Robertson held his union session at the Folger in 1991, I happened to mention this Craig and Timariots, and John Pocock during the seminar said, "Oh my goodness, this is fascinating. Where did you get that?" And I said, "In the ancient constitution, in the feudal." And so this theme raises issues about whether there was landed property in Asia, where there are sort of intermediary feudal landowners as in Europe, and again, how far was Asia similar to or fundamentally different from Europe? And I mean, in India, the Mughal Empire, some people thought, it looks quite like the Holy Roman Empire, that these Rajas are basically inferior vassal princes and so on, but there's nothing like the imperial diet of the Holy Roman Empire. And then there are issues as to whether is feudalism something that's found universally, is that part of a universal stage of development, or perhaps even did Europe get feudalism from Asia? And there's a huge literature around here. One of the more influential works is this Dr. François Bernier writing about Mughal Empire, who said basically there's very limited landed property in India. So this idea of Oriental despotism develops in Montesquieu, who's influenced by Bernier. On the other side of things, there's Anquetil Duperron's work. Duperron, probably more familiar for his scholarship on Zoroastrianism, but also wrote about landed property rights in Asia. And again, there are various other examples of figures such as Sir James Porter here, writing about feudal tenures in the Middle East. And here I've got a couple of English writers who thinks that basically this is Ibbotson and Richardson think that this is some kind of Asian form that is transplanted to Europe from the East, that feudalism isn't indigenous to Europe. And then there's John Miller, the professor of civil law at Glasgow, who's also one of the first sociologists, who thinks that actually there are other countries somewhat remote from Europe where you can find feudal institutions, such as, and he cites Congo, the East Indies, Pegu, the 18th century word for Burma, Turkey, and so forth. And he sees it as like a more general form of law and government. And then there's also this debate on the zamindari class in the Mughal world. Are these zamindars simply officials who are involved in tax collecting and so forth, or are they some kind of intermediate landowning class? There's quite a debate about that. And then finally, of course, this theme. I think the best book I've seen on this theme is Perry Anderson, the Marxist historian's work on lineages of the absolutist state, where he's a critic of the idea of universal feudalism and also of a distinctive Asiatic mode of production. I mean, he argues that in Asia you can find properly feudal forms only in Japan. And Anderson makes great play with Montesquieu identifying feudalism as the key ingredient in what makes European constitutional and political history distinctive. And of course, this raises the whole issue of Marxist historiography, where I think, obviously, the importance of feudalism is much more centrally recognised. But that is another story. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Colin. Thank you. Our third speaker is Ewan MacArthur, who is a third-year PhD student here at the University of Andrews, working on the Isle of Man in British intellectual history. Ewan has an MPhil in political thought from Cambridge and has already published a monograph entitled James Naylor and the Quest for Historic Quaker Identity. Ewan, we're very much looking forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thanks, Colin. Cheers. Thanks, Colin, as well. Okay, so this is a bit more of an enigmatic topic, I think, than even the feudal law. But I'll try and bring people along for feudal law. I'm here today to speak on the ancient constitution and the feudal law. Using Pocock's study of the feudal law as a starting point, my focus will be on ideas about Britain's Scandinavian settlements and rulers, and how these influenced conceptions of the ancient constitution. Modern historians have little considered the place of Britain's Scandinavian incursions in the early modern mind, focusing largely on Anglo-Saxon, Gothic and Norman heritages. The medieval use of the Danes as a political football has been traced in various contexts, and for more recent times, Andrew Warne has outlined the Victorian construction of a Viking. For both medieval and modern authors, the initial wave of Scandinavian raids, large-scale settlement and rule within the Danelaw, beginning in the 9th century, and the rule of England by Danish kings from 1014 to 1042 were all significant. The Danes' early modern construction has been attended to less, yet within debates about an immemorial Anglo-Saxon or Norman constitution, medieval Scandinavians played a sometimes prominent role. These works cast the Danes in various guises. On occasion, they conceived of a Danish yoke, unjustly or deservedly foisted upon the Anglo-Saxons, owing to providential wrath or strategic mismanagement. Ethelred the Unready, whose reign shortly preceded the ascent of King Canute in 1016, often took the brunt of the criticism, although Saxons generally received censure. Others portrayed the Danes as destructive interlopers, without profound effects on English history, either by analogy or contrast with the Normans, while an alternative to this stressed a Gothic inheritance, with the Danes kindred to German or Norman migrants who ought to evoke our sympathy. Finally, some pointed to positive contributions through the Danes' integration or example, with this ranging from northern manliness to the freedom-loving qualities of feudal landholders. A crux of assimilating or separating the Danes from the English persisted, much as it did for the Goths and Normans. English authors grappled, without reaching consensus, over whether the nation was definable by a strictly Anglo-Saxon, wide-ranging Gothic, or cosmopolitan inheritance. This picture was complicated by other intellectual and popular trends. Antiquarians and regional surveyors, drawing inspiration from historical narratives, sought for Scandinavian antiquities in England's physical and cultural makeup. They discovered this, allegedly, in Anglo-Danish customs, commemorations of Viking defeats, and physical artefacts. Given the contemporary construction of the Dane by historians, however, some projection onto England's population and environment was probably going on, and it may be necessary that modern historians are cautious in thinking that ideas of a Danish yoke had wider reach. Popular ideas about Scandinavian rule were more clearly apparent in some islands along Britain's coast. The Isle of Man, Orkney and Shetland experienced much longer Scandinavian government. Norse institutions survived and were often referenced against England or Scotland. In the Northern Isles, this was most prominent in the survival of feudal land tenures, granting occupants an absolute right to the soil, and even an feudal law of Norwegian origins. On the Isle of Man, this took the form of a lordship, parliament and jurisdiction with Norse roots. These were more problematic inheritances which English and Scottish historians sought to downplay. So, in light of both of these questions, of the English constitution being imported or threatened by maritime adventurers, and finding its limit at an island fringe, we might explore the ancient constitution through another Pocockian lens, the call for an archipelagic history of the British Isles. This has usually been considered in light of Scottish, Irish and imperial constitutions, but cracks in the ethnically homogeneous nature of the English constitution came earlier. Individuals discussing national identity were alert to engagements with people overseas, including the introduction of cultural and political forms by Scandinavians. The ancient constitution was partly a maritime inheritance, therefore, being originally imported and then exported across the British Empire. Historians of all stripes grappled with the plural origins of England's past, and diverse political parties contended over Britain's Scandinavian era. So to begin the kind of story of English historians and their thinking about the Danish yoke, the Danes received renewed emphasis in early modern histories owing to several factors. An increased engagement with Scandinavian scholarship, sometimes through translations of older works, so Saxo Grammaticus, Olworm, a Danish author of the 17th century, and Olaus Magnus, who wrote a history of the northern peoples, a Swedish author. This was combined with a general awakening of English national consciousness through published histories and the increasing availability of medieval sources. In alliance with the Tudor monarchy and Reformation Church, scholars looked to legitimate England's present through its past. Historians and chroniclers of the 10th to 15th centuries left too a diverse legacy. Most saw the English as Anglo-Saxons, although argued that their sins or weakness had brought Danish and Norman rule upon them. Others characterised England as a mixed nation, with the Anglo-Saxons lacking moral superiority amongst other migrants. Where then did the emphasis fall from the 16th century onwards? Polydore Virgil's 1534 Anglica Historia controversially worked against Brittonic Arthurian legends, but also espoused what became fairly conventional views, celebrating the Anglo-Saxons, disparaging the Danish yoke, and stressing the Normans' northern origins. The antiquarian William Lambarde, working in the 1560s and 70s, defined the constitution as a Saxon heritage with minor Danish and Norman influences, while his contemporary William Camden excoriated the Danish yoke. Camden occasionally assimilated the Danes and Normans, but also contrasted Danish barbarity with Norman civility and favoured an Anglo-Saxon heritage overall. Against this incipient Saxonism, others propounded more relativistic views. Raphael Holinshed's 1577 Chronicles favoured the Saxons overall, but placed emphasis on their being one of many conquerors, with their sinfulness bringing forth Danish and Norman yokes. This represented a more cosmopolitan position, seeing the nation as defined by successive waves of people. Amongst 17th century poets and playwrights, meanwhile, the view that the Isles' Brittonic people suffered under a Saxon yoke had continued traction. So moving into the early 17th century, the slowly prevailing interpretation of the English constitution was of its embodiment of Gothic liberties, with accents placed on either a shared German background or Anglo-Saxon exceptionalism. Richard Verstegen's 1605 restitution of decayed antiquity represented a strong Anglo-Saxonism, but it painted the Saxons both resisting Danish and Norman influence and receiving their customs sympathetically owing to a shared Gothic background. Henry Spellman mixed ideas of a Gothic stock with contributions from many nations to English history. He recognised the Danes' presence but ultimate similarity to the Anglo-Saxons. Spellman was receptive to this partly through correspondence with the Danish scholar Olaus Wormius, who was tracing the shared origins of Angles, Saxons and Danes. Others emphasised the Normans' descent from Danish settlers. William Hakewill, like Camden and Lambarde, a member of the Elizabethan College of Antiquaries, went beyond Spellman in arguing that the Danes influenced the Saxons more than the Normans. This was discernible given that the confluence between English and Norman laws, and therefore Danish laws, was apparent before the conquest. In a like fashion, John Selden made the case for Anglo-Saxon continuity owing to the kindred status of Danish and Norman rulers, relative to one another and the English. Overall, different emphases fell upon Anglo-Saxon purity, Gothic expansion, and a mingling of nations. So moving forward again, the diversity among Elizabethan and early Stuart writers continued into the Revolutionary period. The jurist Nathaniel Bacon has typically been considered a forthright Anglo-Saxonist, but his views on the Danes and Normans echoed Hakewill's and Selden's. Bacon rendered the Normans and Danes aliens to the English, but also fellow Goths. By his reckoning too, the Normans and Danes' shared northern background meant that Danish mixing with the English aided the Normans' eventual assimilation. As a result, Danish migrations and rulers mediated Anglo-Saxon continuity. By contrast, those accepting but decrying Norman influence such as the early John Lilburne and John Hare, maintained that the Danish yoke had been successfully repelled, with the Norman conquest an aberration. The leveller influence John Waugh differed again. Waugh's pamphlets eschewed historical or ethnic appeals, encouraging Englishmen to claim their natural rights. Saxon, Danish and Norman conquerors had all been bad for freedom. In later life, John Milton's History of Britain took a similar path of blaming Saxon infidelities for the Danish yoke, while also equating both ultimately with the Normans. Moderation towards the Danes was also forthcoming, however. Meditating on the ethnic origins of England's laws, jurist Matthew Hale thought a singular attribution impossible, given the Danes' rule among others. Restoration royalists, often approaching conquest theory, counselled readers to see the Danes in a positive light alongside Anglo-Saxon and Norman conquerors. The press censor Roger Lestrange argued for their fundamental similarity, while Brady used the Danes to illustrate another case of conquest and constitutional alteration in English history. Whigs and Republicans predictably contended otherwise. Algernon Sidney attributed England's freedoms to a Gothic tradition and argued that the English descended from Anglo-Saxon, Danish and Norman migrants. By contrast, in the 1680s and 90s, William Petit and James Tyrrell supported a Gothic inheritance, but also maintained the uniqueness of Anglo-Saxon government and the equivalent failures of the Danish yoke and Norman invasions. Seeming to assume rather than argue this position, Paul de Rapin thought the Danes not notable in the early 18th century, and Whig historians sometimes excluded them altogether. There were further variations in English thought, with contemporary encounters with Denmark also filtering through to historical debates. In the Revolutionary period, the connection of the Danish House of Oldenburg to the Stuarts may have sullied writers' opinions of the Dane. By contrast, diplomat Guy Miege's 1683, The Present State of Denmark, written to mark the wedding of Anne Stuart and Prince George, perceived a natural friendship between Danes and Englishmen, given their shared origins and encounters. The works of the widely travelled English diplomat William Temple pursued a more patriotic line, celebrating a shared Gothic stock while denying direct Danish influences. Robert Molesworth, a former ambassador to Denmark and radical Whig, adopted a more controversial, if still complex, account. His 1694 account of Denmark attacked the Northern Kingdom's move to absolutism since the 1660s, using this as a stick to beat political opponents in England too. But Molesworth's text also compared favourably the historically free nature of the Danish constitution with England's Gothic origins, arguing that the two were intertwined. This was to mix ancient Gothicism with contemporary Anglo-Saxonism, while also gesturing towards cosmopolitan views. Patriotic, Gothicist and cosmopolitan perspectives continued to contrast. Daniel Defoe thought the English a mongrel half-bred race, infused betwixt a Saxon and a Dane, while Scottish poet James Thomson saw the English, Danes and Normans as all fundamentally Gothic peoples. Tory historians of the early 18th century came round, intriguingly, to patriotic Old Whig views. Bolingbroke, alongside others, took the line that the Englishmen, Danes and Normans shared a free Gothic origin, but also that the latter two had had little effect on England's constitution. Adjacent to this was increased attentiveness to Old Norse literature and language, which began to subtly recast the Danes. Scottish historian John Campbell, writing in 1743, urged in light of these that the historic Danes were not barbarians, a perspective which soon gained currency amongst poets and critics. English philological studies, foremost from the non-juror John Hicks, had already begun to examine the Old Norse language. By the 1740s and 50s, Jacobite Thomas Cart was combining Anglo-Saxonist Gothicist and cosmopolitan perspectives. Carte's General History of England contended that the Danes came for settlement, not just raiding, and had genuinely divided English loyalties. But Carte also made the case that Anglo-Saxon, Dane and Norman derived from the same stock, making the integration between legal norms easy. David Hume's History of England charted a similar, though less triumphant, trajectory, arguing that the Danes had sufficiently weakened the Anglo-Saxons to make the Norman conquest possible. In legal studies, meanwhile, Hale's argument that Danish customs had occasionally influenced English law continued to hold water. If historians often define national identity by what it opposed, in early modern England, the Dane was a simpler foe to celebrate victory over than the Norman. But alongside celebrations of English strength, existed views that the nation's constitution was formed by different peoples, or that the Danes were virtually identical with Anglo-Saxons. This partly undermined patriotic attitudes, but mostly combined with them, and through various byways, the ancient constitution was upheld. So now I'm going to move on to Antiquarianism, which is another kind of field in which these arguments are explored. Alongside these attempts to forge a national historical narrative stood the efforts of antiquarians to record the vestiges of the past. Where modern historians have appreciated the Danish yoke in early modern England, they have usually pointed to popular traditions rather than written histories. The best place to find plebeian voices, in turn, have been the records of antiquarian and regional surveyors. Daniel Wolfe, Adam Fox and Keith Thomas, amongst others, have supported this thesis, while cautioning against seeing yokist ideas as issuing entirely from the populace. There was no sharp divide, of course, between elite or literate and popular or oral cultures. Further qualification might, however, be necessary. In the 19th century, Andrew Warne has traced how intellectuals localised their knowledge of the Vikings, whether in the Danelaw or areas of northwest England, and the same process is observable earlier. Many of the historical scribes considered above, particularly in the 16th and 17th centuries, also carried out antiquarian surveys, or worked alongside those that did, and surveyors may have been affected by their historical reading as much as their interaction with the lower orders. Literature concerning folklore has often been guilty of imposing associations, as well as mistakenly detecting survivals in popular culture, and this process may have been at play here. Antiquarian studies typically illustrated regional surveys with details of Danish military campaigns, helping to localise the Danish yoke. Many identifications were, however, incorrect. Battle sites were misplaced, and prehistoric Roman and Anglo-Norman fortifications were attributed to the Danes. Surveyors appropriated oral reports in ways which altered their meanings, and even invented them. In some cases, a percolation downwards probably occurred. The association of Hock Tuesday celebrations with the expulsion of the Danes, for example, seemed to filter into popular consciousness from earlier written histories. Sixteenth century antiquarians intensified these associations. John Leyland and John Lambard, in particular, referenced Danish sites and customs, citing a combination of local reports and their deductions from historical research. In Camden's Britannia, this went into overdrive. Camden identified many sites of Anglo-Danish conflict, often spuriously by linking a name or topography to knowledge from medieval histories. Perhaps most influentially, he combined a speculative etymology and traditional knowledge to identify the Rollright stones, a prehistoric survival, as a monument erected by the first Duke of Normandy, Rollo the Dane. Camden pioneered this process, but also seems to have been responding to pressure from others, at some points denying local speculation about Danish remains. This linking of localities with the Danes, whether accurate or incorrect, infused antiquarian literature. Prompted by encounters with English histories and foreign scholarship, especially concerning Danish megalithic monuments, the misidentified sites should also lead us to question the discoveries of oral reports about the Danes. These continue to appear in tandem. The attempt of court physician Walter Charlton to attribute Stonehenge to the Danes fell flat, but the fieldwork of John Aubrey in the later 17th century developed more sophisticated, though still largely faulty ways of distinguishing Danish from Saxon monuments. Taking inspiration from Aubrey, Robert Plott's county surveys again combined speculation about Danish battle sites with supposedly popular memories of Danish rule. While antiquarians generally became more sceptical of this, apparent discoveries remained in newer regional surveys. These collections furnish our main evidence of folklore about the Danish yoke. Within them, the analysis of physical structures forms the larger part of their findings. Materials relating to Scandinavian influence were often being discovered according to pre-existing schemas, however. As historians became conscious about a Danish yoke, they found it among the remains of material and mental culture. In England, overall, the Danish yoke came forward in several iterations. Intellectuals contended over the relationship of the Anglo-Saxon to the Dane and extended the understanding of the Danish yoke to the population. The acceptance that the Danes had profound outcomes for England was mostly confined to the analysis of physical monuments and local customs surrounding victories. These were actually dubious aspects of the Danish legacy, but importantly supported notions of a popularly revered and relatively pristine ancient constitution. The constitution's pristineness was more difficult to maintain in more Scandinavianised areas of the British Isles, such as the Isle of Man and Northern Isles of Orkney and Shetland. In their cases, Scandinavian affiliations and institutions more clearly remained, but in conflict with metropolitan elites. It is these places, controlled by Norwegian rather than Danish settlers, to which we now turn. All three islands were subject to degrees of Norwegian rule from the 9th century, and had from the 11th to 13th centuries been united under a Norse kingdom of the Isles. Man was the seat of this Norwegian sub-kingdom until 1266, and under English suzerainty it retained a feudal lordship, parliament, and independent legal system with roots in the Norse era. Its population was largely Gaelic, whereas Shetland and Orkney were probably settled entirely by Norsemen, only coming under pronounced Scottish influence from the 13th century, and eventually crown control in 1469. The islands retained, nonetheless, Norwegian laws until 1611, Udal land tenures which gave an absolute right to the soil, making them more allodial than feudal, and societies inflected with Norwegian manners, including the retention of a Norn dialect. Britain's Scandinavian fringe offered distinct examples of the tendency to weaponise a divided ethnic inheritance. In these spaces, the population appeared alien to, rather than united with, England and Scotland. In the Northern Isles, the Norse legacy was fiercely contended over in the 19th century. At that time, Shetland and Orkney activists contrasted free Udalism with Scottish feudalism concerning land rights and wider political freedoms. This accentuated the importance of Udal tenures, deriving from allodial or odelsrett tendencies in Norway, and even posited the existence of a comprehensive Udal law. In the early modern period, by contrast, Scottish historians typically diminished Norwegian influences or the reality of land tenures without a feudal superior. Robert Sibbald was the first Scottish antiquarian to cast his eye on the islands. He discussed their Udal lands, but also remarked on the laziness of those inhabitants of Norse descent. Intriguingly, Sibbald attested to the islanders' conviction around Saint Olaf, the 11th century founder of their land rights. This knowledge was relatively esoteric. Even if St. Olaf received veneration across Norway and its dependencies, and given that Sibbald wrote to support the Scottish crown, its fabrication was unlikely. Antiquarians following Sibbald produced more distant accounts, leaning into Scottish and Presbyterian identities. Some judged that Norn was Pictish rather than Scandinavian, and often writers shortened the period of Norwegian rule by several centuries, as well as showing a lack of interest in Norse-derived customs and beliefs. Despite this, Udal tenures continued to receive brief coverage, with acknowledgement of their attribution by locals to Norwegian kings. Concessions became increasingly apparent in the Scottish view. In 1733, for example, Shetland landowner Thomas Gifford argued that the Norwegian influence had been profound. Gifford equally reckoned, however, that the Udal tenure had been exploitative and ultimately removed after the Restoration. Udal tenures continued to exist in Scots law, and from the 1750s, studies of the islands charted the early retention of Norse laws, the continuing existence of Norn and Norse customs, and even portrayed the Udal tenure positively. Nonetheless, all this differed from the polemical discourse of the 19th century, or our modern appreciation of the island's Norse legacy, in which Norwegian affinities and Udal rights must be seen to retain force, however vestigial. The Isle of Man differed again. It had come under English suzerainty in 1333, but retained a parliament named Tynwald, which originated from the assembly or thing of the Scandinavian world, institutions which Orkney and Shetland also possessed until 1611. Man also retained an hereditary feudal sub-king, more commonly known as the Lord of Man, who possessed substantial legal and prerogative powers. Manx law equally had Norse roots, although its land tenures were probably not Udal, even if they allowed occupiers extensive rights. Early English historians of Man, beginning with Camden, incorporated materials covering the Norse period in a relatively passive manner. Many writers of the 17th century emphasised the munificence of English rule and otherwise offered commentary on the Manx Gaelic population rather than former Norwegian rulers. From the late 17th to early 18th centuries, fuller perspectives began to emerge, however, ranging from condemnation of Norse tyranny to acknowledgement of their contribution to Manx politics and culture. The existence of the Manx Parliament and lordship became controversial at this time owing to the rise of smuggling. The island's lords, Tynwald and jurisdiction shielded it from British customs officials, although the question was less over Norse influences than where sovereignty lay between Britain and Man. The island population defended their rights by pointing to insular traditions with occasional Norse references. Most of Man's historians reported that the people believed in the legendary rule of 12 King Orries, with this being a corruption of a 10th or 11th century King Godred, which ultimately granted legitimacy to Man's lordship. Island legislators and petitioners referred to King Orry's days, the Manx kingdom, and Norse origins generally. A vague immemorialism competed here with vague attestations to Norse roots. There was, regardless, a genuine political tradition steeping itself in the Norse past and attaching itself to identifiably Norse institutions. Whether in Man, Orkney or Shetland, the Scandinavian past was a contested resource between the intellectuals and the masses. So to conclude, these islands were liminal spaces between Britain and Europe. For English maritime vulnerability was always a feature of accounts of the Danish yoke. Proponents of Anglo-Saxon exceptionalism and Gothicist origins appreciated that constitutional liberties had come in part from overseas. Those accepting cosmopolitan, including Danish influences, naturally did too. Many thinkers underlined England's susceptibility to Danish assaults as an island, and Selden's account of England's wave of migrations was accompanied by his 1635 Mare Clausum, which analysed the sovereign control of the seas. It is more questionable whether Anglo-Danish memory circulated among the population, although analysis of oral reports and architectural remains forms an important aspect of the Anglo-Danish tradition. Despite differences of interpretation, both historical narratives and antiquarian studies posited national agreement on these matters. By contrast, Britain's Scandinavian settlements created a discontinuous relationship between England and Scotland with their outer isles. In their cases, writers became conscious not only of the mixed genesis of the constitution, but also its limitations. These islands ultimately served as reminders of the ancient archipelagic limits of the constitution, a lesson which had important implications for the future. Thanks.
Thank you, Ewan. That was fantastic, and a really great reminder, actually, of the way in which, even in the 18th century, that awareness of the Danish prehistory already complicated understandings of ancient constitution and feudal law.
All right, should we start again? I just want to renew thanks to St Andrews for lovely hospitality today. I associate John Pocock with cake, not because I ever met him, but because he is the sort of writer who repays sitting down and reading at the pace of coffee and cake while you're reading. So thank you to St Andrews for hospitality. We want to move straight into session 2 without further ado, and it's a great pleasure to introduce Richard Fisher. He has been until recently Vice President of the Royal Historical Society, Chair of its Publications Committee. He's an historian by training, worked in publishing for many years at Cambridge University Press, where he worked closely with Quentin Skinner as well as with John Pocock on their History of Political Thought list. That seems to me, looking at his biography, to be just a small area of his interests. He's astonishingly wide in his expertise and generous to the number of bodies for whom he has worked. Thank you so much, Richard. Richard's going to speak to us on publishing Pocock, and I think we're in for a treat.
Thank you, Emma, and thanks to everybody. Huge thanks to Colin and Richard particularly for their very kind invitation to speak to you today. Camera's there, isn't it? That's right. And in so doing to catch up with some very old friends, which is lovely. I was saying last night, it's a real sign of old age. You realise you used to publish the fathers of people who are now distinguished vice-chancellors. That's a truly scary prospect. Well, there you go. Anyway, this is the third in an informal sequence of talks I've given over the years about the experience of publishing and working with a trio of senior scholars closely associated both with the University of Cambridge and with its constituent University Press, where I worked from 1983 until 2014, initially as a graduate trainee, but latterly as the managing director of the academic publishing division. More importantly, for present purposes, I was the CUP editor responsible for Cambridge Publishing and History of Ideas for about a quarter of a century, from the mid-80s onwards, and continued to look after a handful of carefully chosen authors, including John Pocock, even when nominally responsible for the academic business as a whole. Now, Richard very kindly published a version of the first of these talks on Quentin Skinner in the Journal of the History of European Ideas, and the second, on Maurice Cowling, was a postprandial part of the Simon Green, Robert Crowcroft project devoted to Cowling, the fruits of which Colin reviewed in the LRB. And appropriate enough, I first met today's subject, John Pocock, in Quentin Skinner's rooms in Christ College in the late 1980s, when we were discussing what was to become the blue Cambridge text version of John's mighty Harrington edition. This was the beginning of what became, I hope and think, a very productive professional relationship on both sides. Certainly the syndics, who were the governors of CUP, seemed to value it, and not unimportantly, in due course, John and I would become very good friends. Now, as we've heard, John's own relationship with CUP began publication in 1957 of The Ancient Constitution and the Feudal Law, a work only rendered comprehensible to a whole generation of undergraduates, so Quentin once told me, because of the excellence of the blurb, which always reminds me. This was reissued by the press with a new retrospective chapter from John in 1987, prompting Conal Condren, reviewing same for the Antipodean journal Paragon, to comment on the book's manifest sense of continuing intellectual vitality, something which of course remained true of its author for almost all of the next 37 years. John's next two book-length publications reflected in their choice of publisher his professional move to the States in 1966. The essays collected in Politics, Language and Time, being published by the University of Chicago Press, North America in 1972, and the Athenaeum Books on this side of the pond. But still more notably, of course, The Machiavellian Moment, appearing with Princeton in 1975, and that too reissued as a Princeton classic at the end of 2016, with a major new introduction from Richard. Princeton were to publish also John's important Folger collection on three British revolutions in 1980, and Indiana-based Hackett Publishing released John's edition of Burke's Reflections in 1987. Latter part, CUP was fortunate enough to publish the remainder of John's book-length output. So we need to come back to the great Harrington edition of 1977, at least for a moment. This was published in a now rather forgotten series called Cambridge Studies in the History and Theory of Politics. The almost fabulously dysfunctional and entirely male editorial board, of which at various times included, inter alia, Professors Elton, Pole, Kadori, JGAP himself, and also, I think, Maurice Cowling. The series had two strands: texts, which included John's Harrington edition, but also things like John Burroughs' edition of Humboldt on state action, and studies, which began with Maurice Cowling's famous book on 1867, but also included important works from inter alia Donald Winch, Dieter Sklar, Schlemmer Avenari, and a bit later Michael Bentley on the liberal mind. Now, when I say that the editorial board of this series was quite fabulously dysfunctional, it's worth pausing and noting en passant that the behaviour of this happy band prompted the only emergency general meeting of the press syndicate of the University of Cambridge in living memory. This is an important bit of bio here. Patricia Skinner, as she then was, when married to Quentin, subsequently Patricia Williams when married to Bernard. Patricia was the senior CUP publisher in the arts and social sciences at the time, and Geoffrey Elton was the senior humanities syndic. And the extremely idiosyncratic nature of Cambridge history list during the 60s and 70s owes a lot to Sir Geoffrey's influence. Anyway, Patricia's attempts both to reform the list in general and the Cambridge Studies series more specifically met with very spirited resistance from the editorial board, culminating in a special general meeting of the syndics where Elton and his colleagues and senior press staff thrashed through a number of what nowadays would be called sensitive issues. Anyway, we all came out the other side, and on publication, John's Harrington edition was reviewed widely, far more so than would be the case nowadays, including in the American Historical Review, where I'm pleased to note that Christopher Hill, in himself I think a very interesting choice of reviewer, started his notice by saying, "This is the first edition of Harrington for over 2 centuries, and a very good one it is too. The text is established with meticulous care. Reviews very rarely offer such a categorical and confident statement of merit nowadays." A decade later, by which time the series of Cambridge texts in the history of political thought was at the height of its very considerable productivity, the case for including both Harrington and an editorial contribution from John himself seems self-evident. Thus it was that I was summoned to Christ's one lunchtime to be introduced by Quentin to the great man for the first time. So the Harrington Cambridge text volume was actually quite a straightforward project to bring together and came out in August 1992. Happily, that book sold quite well, nearly 6,000 copies to date across various formats. John and I seemed to get along, sufficient that I was prompted to ask him at some point a bit later the classic publisher's question of, "What are you up to now?" I remember John saying, in an act of truly heroic understatement, that he was, and I quote, "thinking about Gibbon," and that a book project was gradually taking shape in his mind. Now, naturally, I expressed en principe enthusiasm on behalf of the syndics. Over the next few years, we corresponded regularly about what was to become barbarism and religion, meeting up from time to time at Johns Hopkins as both the ambition and, in publishing terms, the sheer scale of the enterprise began to take shape. What had been informal expressions of mutual goodwill became a formal contractual relationship. And finally, in the summer of 1998, a huge package arrived from Baltimore containing what would be the first 2 volumes in the sequence. Now here, I must ignore the conventional protocols and publicly thank a number of people who acted as referees for barbarism and religion over the years, including David Womersley, but amongst whom the late and much missed Nick Phillipson has to take pride of place. Now, Nick had, of course, been the co-editor with Quentin of the Festschrift for John Pocock, Political Discourse in Early Modern Britain, that CUB had published in 1993. And Nick, as John acknowledged in the format of the Volume 1, was a massively important critical friend to the Barbarism and Religion project for the rest of his life, asking probing questions of its author and thinking always about shape, structure, and how the argument could be best presented. Now, in purely practical terms, how to publish this substantial opening salvo was not immediately evident, and it was only later that what now seems an obvious symmetry between Gibbon's 6 volumes and Pocock's 6 volumes emerged. Even if it had been in the recesses of John's mind from the outset, it certainly wasn't in mine. Anyway, John and I agreed that 2 separate volumes, both of decent but not elephantine size, would be the way to launch the sequence. And in 1999, these duly appeared, packaged in an elegant box for the giveaway price of £49.50 for the pair. So I would have bought them, but I had a packing issue leaving Cambridge yesterday. It was a choice between them and my golf shoes, and I'm afraid the golf shoes won, but there you go. Anyway, the publication of the first 2 volumes was certainly an event, at least within the rarefied world of the history of ideas. Even if reviewers, and it's quite obvious looking back now, didn't sometimes know quite what to make of this preliminary salvo. Clearly the portent of much more to come, but I think they all uniformly recognise the serious and particularly the ambition of intent. Now I do think, as much more importantly did John, that Cambridge made a proper job of barbarism and religion in terms of the production editorial values encapsulated therein, and this standard was pretty well maintained over the next 16 years as the volumes emerged in a variety of subsequent formats, both in print, as hardbacks and paperbacks, and as e-books of one sort or another. Now, inevitably, the sales of the initial 2 volumes were the strongest, about 1,750 in hardback, and the curve of the remaining 4 thereafter showed a gentle but far from calamitous descent. Once people know and expect that a paperback's coming, inevitably their temptation to shell out the initial hardback is more easily resisted. Anyway, sadly, during 2014, I wasn't at all well, and in fact stepped down from my grown-up job at Cambridge at the end of the year, 6 months prior to publication of the 6th and final volume in John's sequence. The completion of the cycle naturally prompted a further significant boost to review coverage, including some major summaries of the whole undertaking, whether in symposium form, as in the Journal of the History of Ideas in 2016, or from individuals, notably in today's company, Brian Young's extended 2017 piece in Erudition and the Republic of Letters. Barbarism and Religion is, by any measure, I think, one of the most remarkable single-author monographic sequences to be published in the past half-century. And I do feel, very privileged to have played some modest part in its gestation. Now, just in closing, to open this brief paper out a little, questions of open peer review are much in public academic discourse at the moment, or notably more so in the sciences than in the humanities. And it does in many ways remain a great, albeit understandable, shame that hundreds of thousands of pages of serious academic engagement are hidden in the reports submitted by referees working for the CUP syndics or the Oxford delegates and their various transatlantic equivalents. In this Pocockian context, I'm thinking perhaps especially of a review John Donne undertook for the syndics on the essay collection that became Political Thought and History, Essays on Theory and Method, 2009, in which John articulated at some length the special, indeed unique qualities of Pocock's work and the breadth and intensity of his engagement with the history of political thought, something, as John said, perhaps unmatched by any other scholar of our time. Now, there's a growing argument, I think, that this and other similar important intellectual interventions ought at some point, anyway, to be in the public domain. But I think just to end with some more personal memories, one of the most important human qualities of John, and one defining trait by which I always measure senior academics, was the way in which he dealt with more junior, clerical and secretarial staff, publishing assistants, production controllers, and the like. And on this measure, and just like, I have to say, Quentin and Maurice Cowling, John scored very highly, treating such colleagues as individuals to be respected in their own right, remembering their names properly, which sounds, but it's, valuing what they did on their own terms and never getting directly cross with them. You can get cross with me, but you can't get cross with and John scored, as I say, very highly on that point of view. And as several obituarists, I think, have already recognised, John always assumed that you knew far more than you actually did about the subjects he was thinking about, or at very less spoke to you as if he did. We had so many memorable meetings, memorable lunches with John. I'm sure some of you have all had memorable lunches with John. I remember once in Hopkins, on a sort of spring day about 20 years ago, he'd had a double height quadruple bypass, I think, about a week before. We went out, he had the Olympic burger with a large glass of red, and he was a subscriber to Nigella's famous theory that any dish is improved by a fried egg on top. So, this was literally about 2 weeks after major heart surgery. But, he was an astonishing man. I say, during more than 40 years of working in the university press sector, I've met and indeed worked with some truly remarkable people. But in that pantheon of distinction, John Pocock will always occupy a unique and elevated position. He was an astonishingly learned man and warmly compelling company, always. Many thanks for listening. Thank you.
Afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this session. Just while you're settling, I'm going to indulge myself for a moment. I felt a bit like the shade of Nick Phillipson was stalking the room this morning. And it was through Nick, who was my PhD supervisor, that I first met John Pocock when I was a raw graduate student in 1978. Nick thought it would be a great idea if I went and studied with Pocock for a year. I said, well, okay, why not? So with chapter 1 of Politics, Language and Time stuffed in my back pocket, I went over to Johns Hopkins and got introduced to John. And characteristically, my first memory of this was ambling across the quad at Hopkins to the library, where John, in a very characteristic vocabulary, said he had a desk space that he was happy to sub-infudate to me. Only John Pocock, I think, would say something like that. But he, of the sort of wry smile and the twinkling eyes, he's a wonderful man. Something Richard was saying this morning reminded me very much of him, that he never talked down to people, he was never condescending, which was great. But there is a downside to it. It meant that he talked as if you knew everything, in the way that he seemed to know everything. And as a raw postgraduate, most of it was totally over my head. And actually, I think that's probably true of the 6 volumes of Barbarism and Religion, but perhaps I shouldn't go there. It's my pleasure to introduce our 2 speakers. First of all, Valerie. I have some notes, which I've forgotten to bring with me. Valerie is a recent addition to the staff here at St Andrews, where she's a lecturer in Scottish history and the wider world, I believe. She's a product initially of Glasgow, where she did her doctorate with Colin Kidd. Most recently, she's been in New Zealand, and I'm reading the notes on John Robertson, which is not very helpful. She was previously a lecturer in history at Victoria University of Wellington in New Zealand. Her monograph, which I think is based on her thesis on Scottish Presbyterianism and settler colonial politics, was published in 2018. And she's now working on aspects of Scots law in the British Empire. And she's going to talk to us today about the Treaty of Union of 1707 and another treaty which most of us will probably never have heard of, but which I hope she is going to explain the significance of. So, Valerie.
Thank you, Roger. Okay, thank you so much. It really is a privilege to be here and speak to you today. As Roger said, I'm originally from Scotland, but I spent 10 years working in a New Zealand university. And I also have Pakeha, by which I mean New Zealand European children. And so a lot of what Pocock had to say about New Zealand academia, but also the condition of being never quite at home, wherever you are, really resonates with me. So for Pocock, the voyage on the Waka canoe was as important to the telling of New Zealand's history as the whenua, the land. And it's that liminal perspective that I hope to bring to my topic today, a comparative study of the two unions. As Roger said, the Anglo-Scottish Union of 1707 and Te Tiriti o Waitangi, the Treaty of Waitangi, signed in 1840 in Aotearoa, New Zealand. So Pocock brought these two intellectual preoccupations together. That is an appreciation of what became known as Four Nations British history and the centrality of unions to that history, and the history of Waitangi and New Zealand's divided culture, as he put it, together in his 2005 collection, The Discovery of Islands. And by exploring the role of a Scot and his understanding of the Anglo-Scottish Union in Waitangi's drafting and interpretation, what I'm hoping to emphasise today is the importance of appreciating the plurality of the British metropolitan states in New Zealand's constitutional history, which is less divided than we might think. So before I get started properly, I would like to acknowledge the support of the Royal Society of New Zealand, Te Aparangi Marsden Fund, which supported the research on which this presentation is based. So, though drafted almost 150 years apart, and for different reasons, there are similarities between the two treaties, how they were framed, how they've subsequently been interpreted, although they've seldom been studied side by side. Both are now regarded by many as foundational documents in their respective nation states, though the place of both in the constitutions of these states remains unstable. So let me start with the Treaty of Waitangi, which might be unfamiliar to some of you, as Roger said. So here's a picture of my son's nursery class at the Te Papa Museum, looking at the Treaty of Waitangi exhibit. Ben was only 3 at the time, and it obviously made an impression because for his 4th birthday we asked him what he'd like to do, and he said, "I want to go and see the treaty," which was a proud parental moment, I have to say. So you heard this morning that his grandfather, that Jamie talked about, is on his own treaty journey at the age of 82. Well, Ben is just beginning his own at the age of 4. Anyway, so Te Tiriti o Waitangi, the Treaty of Waitangi, between the British Crown and about 530 Maori chiefs, was first signed on the 6th of February 1840 at Waitangi in what is now known in English as the North Island of New Zealand. And it was one of the ways by which Britain annexed the country. There was an English language version, which was drafted first, probably in the days leading up to the 6th of February. That was drafted before the Maori language version. So the English language version was drafted by a group of people. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. And who were essentially giving expression to the instructions given to them by the Colonial Office. So James Stephen, the Undersecretary at the Colonial Office, has been described as really the principal architect of the treaty. So once there was an English language text, the full copy of which has been lost, that was then given to 2 missionaries to translate into the Maori language. After that, there was some discussion at Waitangi, and then copies of the Maori language version, for the most part, were taken round the country, and it was that version of the treaty that most Maori rangatira, that is Maori chiefs, signed. Only 39 signed the version in English. So the treaty has a preamble and 3 articles, and there are apparent differences between the 2 versions. So in Article 1 of the English version, Maori agree to cede sovereignty, while in the Maori version they cede kawanatanga, defined in recent decades as expressing to Maori a limited form of governance, principally governance over British subjects and protection against foreign threats. And in Article 2 of the English version, Maori retain possession of their lands. In the Maori version, they retain te tino rangatiratanga, defined in recent decades as meaning independence or self-determination, full chieftainship over their iwi, their tribes. And Article 2 also gave the Crown the right of preemption, though this monopoly right of purchase wasn't adequately expressed in the Maori version. And then there was a third article, and there's not much of a difference between the two versions there. That gave Maori all the rights of British subjects. So, in the aftermath of signing, the treaty was a matter of contestation. But then, sort of after that, in the aftermath of the New Zealand Wars, when settlement had sort of stepped up and land acquisition had stepped up, the treaty sort of fell out of view. And the treaty documents themselves sort of disappeared for a while. In Parata versus Bishop of Wellington in 1877, which is probably the most famous case in New Zealand history, Chief Justice James Prendergast infamously described the treaty as a simple nullity. And his view became Pakeha Treaty orthodoxy. Maori hadn't possessed sovereignty in 1840, they hadn't been proprietors of the land, mere occupiers whose rights weren't legally enforceable, and who had no interest at all in unoccupied land, and sovereignty was indivisible. One law, English law, applied to Maori and Pakeha, and the New Zealand Parliament was supreme. And by the time of Prendergast's judgment, control over Maori affairs had been wrested from the governor, and land policy was really in the hands of responsible ministers who passed legislation in the New Zealand Parliament confiscating Maori land. So that's the Treaty of Waitangi. Oh, no, we won't go there. Right, okay. So the Treaty of Union, it probably surprised no one. I don't have an equivalent photograph of a group of nursery school children looking up at it in awe. But anyway, you doubtless know a lot more about that treaty than Treaty of Waitangi, so I don't need to go into a lot of detail. Negotiated, as I said earlier, almost a century and a half before, in 1706, in very different circumstances, but there are some noteworthy parallels. So like Te Tiriti, the treaty, the Union of 1707 constitutes several documents. The treaty with its articles, the acts of the English and Scottish Parliaments ratifying the treaty, as well as accompanying legislation protecting the established churches in England and Scotland. The Union Treaty was longer than Waitangi at 25 articles rather than 3, but like Waitangi, it was concerned with the location of sovereignty, with ensuring equality of rights, and with the protection and perpetuity of certain customs of the treating partners, in Scotland's case, its legal system and its church. Both treaties were arguably international treaties between two independent sovereign powers, and both involved the Crown. In the case of the Union, Queen Anne represented both parties, Queen of Scotland and Queen of England, and those were her two positions, while at Waitangi, Queen Victoria represented the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, and the United Tribes, who had confederated when the Declaration of Independence was drafted in 1835, and independent chiefs who hadn't joined this confederation represented their respective tribes. And also both treaties were drawn up owing to perceived threats from France, and both occasioned debate across the country. And like Waitangi, the Union Treaty fell out of view really in the late 19th century, being regarded in Britain as something approaching a nullity in the era of Dacian orthodoxy. So A.V. Dicey considered the Union to be no more important than any humble Act of Parliament, a view that was accepted in Scottish legal circles. Westminster Parliament was supreme, and its authority was not limited by the treaty. As Stephen Tierney has put it, the orthodox account of the union of Scotland and England is one of an incorporating marriage similar in reality to a conquest of Scotland by the English constitutional system. As the English Parliament essentially survived the union intact, it brought with it into the new state the emerging sense of its own supremacy. The same could be said of New Zealand. Indeed, in 2013, in the run-up to the independence referendum in 2014, the preferred view, the RUK continuator theory, which was presented to Westminster in expert opinion, drafted by Professors James Crawford and Alan Boyle, was that if Scotland seceded, there would be no union to dissolve, only independence to grant. For at 1707, of the two treating partners, only Scotland was extinguished, while England continued under the new name of Great Britain, and later the UK. And in support of that theory, they compared the Treaty of Union to the Treaty of Waitangi. They said Waitangi, as an independent state, had ceded its sovereignty at Waitangi, an independent state had ceded its sovereignty, and the resulting constitutional system could be identified with only one of the two parties, England, at the expense of the other. So it was only really in the second half of the 20th century that both treaties came back into view. So in New Zealand, Maori protests in the 1970s brought the treaty back onto Pākehā radar, as did a landmark article published by Ruth Ross in 1972 in the New Zealand Journal of History, probably the most famous article in that journal after Pocock's, which appeared in 1974. And in that article, Ross claimed that there had been discrepancies between the two treaties, that the framers had deceived Maori into signing, and that the Maori language version was the version to pay attention to because that had been the version that most Maori had signed. Ross's article and the Waitangi Tribunal, which was established in 1975, which in 1985 was given powers to investigate historic breaches of the treaty stretching back to 1840, initiated a wealth of treaty scholarship. Then in the 1980s, the tribunal detected treaty principles in the text. These malleable principles of partnership, protection and participation, which, as Justice Sir Joe Williams has said, hovered above the text, invisible to most readers, were then increasingly recognised in legislation. Thus, some statutory acknowledgement was given to the treaty, which then gave the courts the scope to interpret the treaty in a generous way. Pocock wrote in 2001 that New Zealand had reached the brink of proclaiming its own sovereignty conditional upon a treaty which now approaches the stature of fundamental law. Nevertheless, that treaty remained unfulfilled, and up to this day it's a matter of serious debate, and Sir Geoffrey Palmer, former Prime Minister, thinks that the treaty is half in and half out of New Zealand law. Meanwhile, in Scotland, Lord Cooper initiated a new era of Scottish constitutional interpretation when he issued his dictum in McCormick v Lord Advocate in 1953. In this case, on the constitutionality of the inaccurate title Queen Elizabeth II of Great Britain, Cooper rejected Dacian orthodoxy, arguing that the Union Treaty limited Westminster's supremacy. To Cooper, the principle of the unlimited sovereignty of Parliament is a distinctively English principle which has no counterpart in Scottish constitutional law. And that argument was then developed in the 1970s by Neil McCormick, just as Waitangi was being reassessed in New Zealand. The Union Agreement, in McCormick's eyes, should be regarded as fundamental law. Westminster has no power to abolish the Scottish legal system or to disestablish the Church of Scotland, that is, to override guarantees specified in the Articles of Union and accompanying Act securing the Church. And as Colin has shown, that arguments have underpinned justifications for devolution, beginning with the Claim of Right for Scotland in 1988, just as increasing awareness of treaty principles has underpinned demands for the recognition of Māori rangatiratanga in New Zealand. Now, in both countries, it's been argued, judicial activism over the last half-century has resulted in the propagation of myth histories. So in New Zealand, Bill Oliver and recently Bain Atwood, in a book that came out last year, have expressed concern at the presentist and counterfactual histories being produced in Waitangi tribunal reports, in legal scholarship, and by academic historians who seek not to describe how things actually were, but to lament what could have been and to describe what should be. The notion of treaty principles of partnership has become the new orthodoxy. The contested nature of the treaty, the variety of interpretations of the document, historically and currently, are ignored. The reimagining of the treaty has been the byproduct of the dominance of the Ruth Ross interpretation of what happened at Waitangi, that the texts don't reconcile, that Māori were duped, possibly deliberately, into ceding their sovereignty. And another byproduct of that, the dominance of that interpretation, has been the overwhelming focus on the Māori version of the text. You know, rightly that has been the focus, because that's what they thought they were agreeing to. So the dominance of that article really discouraged any examination of the English text of the treaty and what the framers meant by it. It was assumed that Prendergast's view was reflected in the treaty and was a view expressed by Pakeha, who lived in 1840 and in the decades before 1877. So Carwyn Jones, who's a scholar of Māori law, has said that the Māori text failed to convey the cession of the English concept of sovereignty expressed in the English language text. What was the English concept of sovereignty in 1840, and did it differ to the concept which predominated in the age of Prendergast and Dicey, and how English was it? Meanwhile, in Scotland, Lord Cooper's dictum stimulated a myth history of a distinctive tradition of Scottish constitutionalism, which apparently conflicted with England's doctrine of parliamentary supremacy. In Scotland, as opposed to England, the constitution was founded on the will of the people, on the will of the community, and monarchy was limited. In reality, there was no consensus on how sovereignty should be understood, although in the 18th century there were some who did argue that the treaty limited what Westminster could do, and that argument would sort of rear its head during moments of crisis, including during the disruption. So, you know, as with all myth histories, there's an element of truth that underpins both the narrative of a distinctive constitutional tradition in Scotland, but also this narrative of treaty principles reflected in the Waitangi Treaty. In 2022, Ned Fletcher published a magisterial 723-page book, Pocock would have been proud, on the English text of the Treaty of Waitangi, which challenges treaty orthodoxy. So according to Fletcher's interpretation, the English language and Māori texts of the treaty do in fact reconcile. There was no deliberate deception, says he. The English language text guaranteed that Māori law and internal governance of iwi would be protected. The concept of sovereignty expressed in the English text was not that expressed in 1877 by Prendergast. The framers believed that the treaty was necessary as Māori sovereignty had been acknowledged. They believed that preemption needed to be treated for, and that Māori were full proprietors. They also, according to Fletcher, believed that the sovereignty being ceded was the sovereignty of the federated tribes, who in 1835 had retained their governorship, their rangatiratanga, over their respective tribes, and who retained this right still. Māori law also was protected. So, the views of Prendergast did ultimately prevail in New Zealand, but these were not the views of the framers. Now, one of these framers included James Busby, the British resident, who had long lobbied for a protectorate for New Zealand, and he was responsible for drafting the Declaration of Independence. He was also likely responsible for the second draft of the Treaty of Waitangi, into which he added Article 2 on the protection of property and chieftainship. So, according to Fletcher, Busby gave expression in the document to this idea of pluralistic governance under British sovereignty. Now, Busby drew an explicit parallel between the Treaty of Waitangi and the Treaty of Union. He underlined the guarantees that both made for legal pluralism, and he suggested that both agreements put limitations on Parliament. And I would like to suggest that Busby's understanding of what the Treaty of Waitangi guaranteed, and also the support that he found for his view amongst the Scottish diaspora community, may have been shaped by Scottish understandings of sovereignty and the place of the Union Agreement in the British Constitution. So, James Busby. So Busby's Scottish background and the Scottish context in which he lived and thought really haven't received, as far as I can tell, any attention in the scholarship. He was born in Edinburgh in 1802. He briefly studied at Edinburgh University, but only for about a year. He then moved to Sydney with his family in 1824, and then after that he was appointed British resident in New Zealand between 1833 and 1840. So while he was in New Zealand, he purchased quite a lot of land from Maori, and those land purchases become a real matter of debate, because what happens after the treaty is signed is that the New South Wales Council and then the Council in Auckland pass legislation that essentially invalidate any pre-treaty purchases made by Europeans until they've been investigated by the Crown. If the purchase is found to be valid, then the Crown issued a title to land, but only up to 2,560 acres. Anything beyond that was retained by the Crown. It wasn't returned to the original Maori owners. And so Busby contests this legislation from the outset. He goes to Sydney and argues with the Governor of New South Wales, who has been responsible for the New South Wales legislation, over the interpretation that the Governor puts on the treaty, which is essentially that it's irrelevant because the Crown's sovereignty is founded on the doctrine of discovery, and thus, only Crown-granted titles legally enforceable. So Busby challenges that idea, and he continues to challenge it because his own purchases are still under investigation for decades, and he ends up in court in a case, Busby versus White, in 1859. And this is where he makes this comparison between the two treaties, and that comparison is a central plank of his defence of the validity of his title, the legal status of the treaty, and the plurality of laws and governance which it guaranteed. So, in this case, he's represented by a lawyer, Singleton Rochford, who was originally from Victoria. He worked briefly in Auckland, and then he goes back to Melbourne, and it's there that he works on Busby's case, and it's there also that he has access to more text that he can't get in New Zealand. But I think it's really likely that Busby was involved in the construction of the argument. Busby represented himself in court. He also edited the version of the argument that was then published in the press. Right, so what did they argue? So Busby and Rochford maintained that Busby had purchased land from Maori legitimately, which was something the Maori vendors did not dispute. They said that Maori nations had been sovereign before the treaty signing, and this sovereignty had been recognised by the Crown. The Treaty of 1840 had been an agreement between two independent sovereign powers. These, on the one hand, were represented by Victoria, who was carefully described as the Queen of the Britanno-Hibernian nation, and the various chiefs representing their various iwi. Waitangi was, in fact, a treaty of union, like the Treaty of Union between England and Scotland, or like any other treaty between civilised nations. Before and at the time of the signing of the Treaty of Waitangi, Maori title was as well-founded and indisputable as are those of European states to their respective dominions. English law had from time immemorial permitted subjects to purchase land in foreign territories, and here they drew on feudal law, and they pointed out that Scottish kings had paid homage to English kings on account of the lands that they held in England. So it was many examples from history of foreign subjects going and buying land from other rulers, but then becoming a part of those nations, or owing their homage to those rulers. And this is what Busby had done. He had purchased land from Te Parafau in 1839 according to Maori custom, and had thus become a member of the Paraffel nation. After that, that nation had ceded its sovereignty in 1840, but had had the preservation of all their property and the laws constituting this property guaranteed. And they say, you know, the Maori stood in the same relation to the United Kingdom that the Scots had done to Great Britain after the union of their country with England, and that no judge would have permitted an Englishman who had bought land from Scots, no one would have allowed that purchase to be sort of nullified after 1707. So in Busby's view, Maori law was permissible under the Treaty of Waitangi, just as Scotland's independent laws and property had endured after 1707. The Treaty of Union stipulated that the laws and institutions of England and Scotland should continue in force and operation in their respective countries. These laws and institutions, as well as those subsequently established, had their force by virtue of the treaty. And the British-Irish Union of 1801 had done something similar. So, in their view, there wasn't any inconsistency between the three articles of the treaty. Maori could have property rights protected by rangatiratanga under British sovereignty and still have rights as British subjects, just as Scots retained their private law in Scottish jurisdiction and had rights under the British Crown. Busby and Rochefort's comparison of the two treaties, though, can't be taken as evidence in support of the continuator theory asserted by Crawford and Boyle, however. Though they said that the position of Scotland and Maori was identical, they also argued that Waitangi and the Union were different types of agreement. By the Treaty of Union between England and Scotland, both nations, not just Scotland, had dissolved themselves and their late members united and constituted themselves into a new civil society called the British nation. At Waitangi, by contrast, Paraffel had become a part of the Britanno-Hibernian nation, had become part and parcel of the United Kingdom. And to illustrate this point, Busby and Rochefort asked the court to imagine what would have occurred had such a treaty as Waitangi been agreed to in Scotland in 1707. Those who had been theretofore called Scotchmen would have become members of the English nation, or Englishmen, as happened in the case of the people of Berwick-on-Tweed, upon the cession of that town by Edward Balliol to the King of England. Scotland would have become as much a part and parcel of the Kingdom of England as the county of Middlesex. So this reading of what had not happened at 1707 was likely indebted to Robertson's History of Scotland, which Busby and Rochefort drew on several times in their arguments. Robertson had rejected the idea that the Union state was an English empire, describing the Union as an agreement between two independent crowns. So here's an allusion to that imperial crowns debate that Colin mentioned earlier, that is being discussed in Robertson's text and then influencing Busby and Rochefort's view of the Union in this case. So their point in making that analogy was to say that Maori, as members of an extended British-Irish realm, now had full rights as British subjects to the protection of their property, as well as the rights reserved to them by the treaty. They also both hinted that the treaties were fundamental documents whose existence the Crown could not ignore. Treaties between nations were sacred and inviolable. Subordinate legislatures, such as the Colonial Assembly, had no authority to change the national laws. That the land claims legislation was beyond the Legislative Council's scope. The Treaty of Waitangi was a document inscribed in the Law of Nations and forming a portion of our municipal code. Thus, the local legislature couldn't alter or repeal any part of it. Now, what could Westminster do? So they were a bit sort of contradictory on Westminster's power, because unlike a colonial assembly, Westminster was supreme. Nevertheless, they argued that all laws and institutions now existing derived their vitality from the two unions of 1707 and 1801, and they maintained that all the colonies were bound by these unions. Now, I don't have time to go into the support that this view had from others in the community, but suffice to say that this view, though it was a minority view, was expressed even into the nullity era of the late 19th century. So, what can we take from this? So until Ned Fletcher sort of challenged the received view, it was anachronistically assumed that the sort of dicey and Prendergast interpretation of the British Constitution held sway through 19th century Pakeha New Zealand. But Fletcher's shown that, on the contrary, the framers in 1840 believed that some kind of Maori autonomy was compatible with British rule. James Busby, one of the original framers, compared Waitangi with 1707. Waitangi, as it was conceived by Busby, like the Union, was a treaty between two independent sovereign powers, and it had allowed for an element of pluralistic governance. Now, I want to go back to Pocock just to finish. So in 1974, in the New Zealand Journal of History, Pocock called on New Zealand historians to pay proper attention to Britain's plurality and to the importance of their country's connection with Britain. He wanted them to reassess British history as a shared possession. But, preoccupied with nation building and articulating New Zealand exceptionalism, New Zealand historians like Keith Sinclair tended to ignore him. In the 20th century, it's been argued Pakeha New Zealanders largely forgot their own pasts. Sinclair's 1959 A History of New Zealand had no index entry for Scots. It was only in the 2000s that New Zealand historians really began properly to examine the plurality of their British inheritance. And in response to Keith Sinclair, Pocock suggested that New Zealand possessed two totemic birds, the kiwi, flightless, nocturnal and inhabiting the forest floor, and the godwit, a migratory species whose flocks traversed the Pacific between New Zealand and Siberia and Alaska. Sinclair was the kiwi and Pocock the godwit. The New British History, Pocock wrote, offered New Zealanders a history in which they have taken part, which may help explain them to themselves and to which they may lay claim. Might attention to the significance of Britain's plurality in the history of the framing interpretation of New Zealand's foundational document have something to offer New Zealanders now. As Dame Shan Elias, a former Chief Justice of the New Zealand Supreme Court, has said, it's worth remembering that our original form of representative government enabled a form of federation both in the arrangements for provincial government and in the space left for self-government within Māori districts. These earlier limitations on Parliament and forms of devolution suggest that we should not be too quick to dismiss contemporary calls for similar modern constitutional adaptations as contrary to our history and traditions. They were not unthinkable in the past. Certainly, as I've hinted, they weren't unthinkable to earlier generations of Pakeha Scots, whose interpretations of Waitangi seem to have been shaped by their interpretations of the Union's fundamental status in the Constitution of Britain. Maybe it's time that the Kiwi looked up from the fern roots, from the whenua, to what was happening in the upper winds of the world, to the flight of the Godwit, and to the Waka's voyage. Thanks.
You're going to do that? Thank you very much, Valerie. That was absolutely fascinating. I hope, I'm sure it's going to prompt a lot of questions, but keep them till the end of the session. We're now going to hear our second paper from John Robertson, who will be well known to most of you, I imagine, if not all of you, as a historian of the Scottish, Neapolitan, and indeed European Enlightenments. Formerly a lecturer in modern history at Oxford, and then professor of the history of political thought at Cambridge until 2018, I think. Now, amongst other varied appointments, he's an honorary professor of the history of political thought at St Andrews, part of the Intellectual History Institute. Among numerous publications, which I'm not going to mention, one does stand out as particularly relevant today, and that's an essay he wrote in the History of Historiography in 2019, called Pocock's Histories of Political Thought. I recommend it. It's a brilliant piece of work, and I suspect some of that may be coming our way now. So, John, and I've forgotten the title.
Thank you very much, Roger, thank you. And thank you to Colin and Richard for organising this and inviting me. Can you hear me? Right. Well, the title is, and I'm sorry, I don't have a PowerPoint, but I do have a handout which you can browse. I'm not going through all the passages systematically, but it's there to give you a flavour and examples. The title is Political Thought and History, Two Pocockian Inquiries, or One. And in a sense, it does indeed take off from the article that Roger just kindly mentioned. But the starting point is John Pocock's belief that his achievement as a historian of historiography, that is, of the writing of history, has been underappreciated. And that belief was conveyed to me directly in correspondence. It's also apparent in his published engagements with reviewers of barbarism and religion. In my case, it took the form of critical comments on what became that article on Pocock's Histories of Political Thought, also on the initial proposal for the edited volume which became Time, History and Political Thought. But more generally, Pocock lamented the paucity of reviews of the later volumes of Barbarism and Religion. Richard Fisher said they sold less well. I think they were less noticed. And the consequent absence of an overall assessment of his achievement. And now, neither of those complaints was completely justified. I explicitly tried to trace the histories of political thought through his studies of historiography, from the ancient constitution through to barbarism and religion. And there were reviews, not least by Brian, by Colin, by Tom Pye, of the later volumes. But still, one could see Pocock's point, especially if you looked at the symposium that Richard referred to in the Journal of the History of Ideas, Richard Fisher referred to, organised by Helena Rosenblatt, where John publicly in print confessed himself embarrassed. And embarrassed in particular by the total incomprehension shown by Rosenblatt herself. So his complaint made me think, what was the relationship between the history of political thought and historiography? Were there two distinguishable lines of Pocockian inquiry rather than one seamlessly woven oeuvre? So I start at the beginning with the striking statement, which is the first on the handout, which opens the prefatory note to Pocock's Cambridge PhD thesis. Begun in 1948 under the supervision of Herbert Butterfield. I think the next year Butterfield was on leave and it was J.H. Plum. And then it was written up in what he said was 2 years at Durham, that Pocock spent at Durham on a research fellowship. You can see from the passage that there is already a striking confidence in his voice as a historian. It is remarkable. But what he writes is also precise. This is to be a history of historiography, but not one concerned with the history of scholarship, that is, of the sources and their use. So, actually in the PhD, he makes the point that John Hudson made this morning. He admits it. Don't think that's in the ancient constitution. We'd have to check. So rather what he will do is set out to reconstruct a historical ideology, which he sees as an integral, not merely ornamental, part of 17th century political thinking. In short, the history of historiography and the history of political thought go together. There's no word yet of languages of political thought or even of contexts, although he had by then met Laslett and by Pocock's later account had absorbed the lesson of Laslett's edition of Filmer's Patriarcha, that context was everything, context really mattered. But there is, as you can see, as he says, an intelligible field of study, a system of ideas that might be called the historico-political. Though in a characteristic Pocockian, again, very much the voice gesture, there's a parenthesis which says, I'm not going to use this term. Moving on, the ancient constitution and the feudal law, which Colin started from, 1957, was a considerably expanded version of the thesis. Its subtitle, A Study of English Historical Thought in the 17th Century, suggests a shift of emphasis. And in its preface, what Pocock emphasizes there is his comparative intuition that it was through their legal systems that European nations, France as well as England, had sought to give themselves a history. But if the emphasis had shifted slightly, it was still clear that political thought was the beneficiary of legal historical inquiry. Debate over the ancient constitution would remain central to English politics. When Pocock returned to New Zealand in 1958, after another 2 years in Cambridge as a research fellow, 56 to 8, he wrote 2 distinct methodological articles. Not just one, as Quentin Skinner said on Tuesday. We only got that one. One was explicitly devoted to the history of political thought. That's the one that Skinner mentioned. The other outlined a new comparative approach to historiography. The first characterized its subject's methodology in terms of languages and traditions. Languages cast in a kind of Wittgensteinian mold as necessarily plural, cohering around their own criteria of validation. Traditions presented in a more Oakeshottian vein, entailing that political thinking occurs in recurrent forms, which may well be below the level of philosophy. The second article, though, the one devoted to a comparative approach to historiography, was twice as long and more adversarial. It took aim at the assumption that historiography consisted in study of narratives on the model of the Greek and Roman historians, and then, as it were, jumping forward, of their supersession after 1800 by historicism, the modern philosophy of history developed in Germany. Instead, Pocock suggested that the writing of history be understood as an activity integral to the existence and survival of societies. Now, political communities were societies, but so were churches or legal practitioners. So he's using that term society as a kind of voluntary, more or less voluntary body. Any group which cohered around institutions. And it was typically when the existence of such institutionalized societies was challenged that their members had recourse to writing their history to affirm their existence, utilizing the documentary resources accumulated by their institutions in order to do so. Given this purpose and this way of putting it, the importance of narrative to the writing of history was diminished, and the model form of historical writing was provided by jurists' accounts of the formation of their systems of law. These propositions were supported by a very wide range of reference, not only the English law that Pocock had written about in the ancient constitution, but law in ancient China and legal historical controversy in early modern France, Scotland, and Naples. He refers both to Giannone and Giambattista Vico. And that there, certainly, there is a lot of debate about feudalism. So it's completely central. So understood thus, historiography was inherently political, but as a field of inquiry, I think this second article makes it clear it has a methodological foundation of its own. Pocock's next book, Politics, Language and Time, collected essays which were more concerned with politics in time than with historiography. That's an abbreviation, but I need to press on. The major work which it heralded, the Machiavellian moment, is even more difficult to analyze within the problematic that I'm talking about. In other words, history of political thought, history of historiography. The Machiavellian moment was clearly not a study of political thought written through history, Rather, Pocock framed his account of Renaissance political thought in relation to philosophies of history, customary, providential, and classical or civic humanist. The last of these, the civic humanist, has tended to be identified with republicanism, but rather than identifying republic with a preferred form of government, as so much of the commentary assumes, Pocock uses the term, it's Jacqueline's point, it's a language, and it's a language to convey the vulnerability of all forms of government to contingent circumstances. Commenting on, but not himself writing, the history of Rome, Machiavelli had made the Republic's exposure to necessità the focus of his analysis. The contingency that attaches to all forms of government extended, Pocock would conclude, to the American Republic itself, a finding which he was surprised to learn rendered the Machiavellian moment controversial in the United States. Towards the end of that book, Pocock also discussed the Scottish Enlightenment's approach to what Hannah Arendt had identified as the rise of the social, which challenged the primacy of the political in civic humanism. But it's clear in the Machiavellian moment that Scottish stadial history was at best at the margins of historiography, its account of the progress of society more philosophical than properly historical. And he would return to this point when discussing the Scottish contexts of Gibbon. So I pass on to Gibbon. Pocock approached Gibbon over a period of 20 years through a series of conference papers and essays, beginning with his disconcertingly innovative contribution to the conference that celebrated the decline and fall in Rome in 1976. David Womersley on Tuesday referred to just how different Pocock's contribution was, and that's clear. He was serious about the study of Gibbon. Most of the rest of the people there were celebratory. Rather than follow Pocock through this series of papers, however, I'll move directly to the way he sets up barbarism and religion as historiography. And the key lies in his dedications, or a key lies in his dedications to Volume 1, dedicated to Arnaldo Momigliano, the Italian historian of ancient and also modern historiography, and Volume 2 to Franco Venturi, referred to by Colin. The dedication to Venturi was to a respected antagonist. Venturi was the foremost proponent of one European Enlightenment, and he denied that England belonged to it. In response, beginning with his contribution to Venturi's Festschrift in 1985, Pocock made his case for plural enlightenments, with England's a distinctive instance of what he called conservative enlightenment. More consequential to my purpose, though, was the dedication to Momigliano, for Pocock a model of how to approach historiography. But even so, Momigliano's argument that Gibbon's and more generally Enlightenment's historiographical originality lay in combining philology and philosophy needed revision. The Momigliano view needed revision. Pocock could endorse the importance of philology, the critical assessment of an expanded range of sources, but he questioned the contribution of philosophy. Instead, what he will do in the Barbarism and Religion is foreground the construction of narratives as both a rhetorical and a philological exercise. There was another student of historiography in the background here, whom Pocock viewed more adversarially, and that was Hugh Trevor-Roper. The passages on the handout that I've given you, where he comments on Trevor-Roper, taken from correspondence, indicate the main ground of Pocock's opposition, and I'll come back to that. But there was a deeper lying difference between them. For Trevor-Roper, historiography was at least as much an inspiration a tradition in which to set one's own ambitions, as it was a subject for intellectual history. As such, historiography had for Trevor Roper a crucial pedagogic function displayed in its role in the Oxford School of Modern History. For Pocock, by contrast, the potential of historiography would only be realized if it was studied as a form of intellectual history, in which historical writing too was understood through its languages, and these set in their identifiable contexts. So, as succinctly as possible, I'll now try to show how Pocock applied this approach to Gibbon's narratives. Despite its dedication to Momigliano, Volume 1 of Barbarism and Religion was a series of essays on the contexts of Gibbon's intellectual formation and his exposure to different enlightenments. So it's not so relevant. Volume 2, however, addressed historiography directly, treating what Pocock represented as the primary form of historical writing in the 18th century, narratives of civil government. That's the title of Volume 2. And these included the histories of Naples by Giannone, France by Voltaire, of England by Hume, of Scotland by William Robertson. And they are presented as contexts for the decline and fall, examples of a kind of historical writing for which Gibbon professed admiration, but would not himself pursue. Volume 3 of Barbarism and Religion then examines the series of narratives of Roman history and of imperial decline available to Gibbon and supplying contexts for his retelling of the story. And these include the Tacitian and Appianic narratives, the alternative Augustinian and Eusebian Christian narratives, the topos of the Translatio Imperii, which for Pocock was a meta-historical concept rather than a narrative in its own right, and later the humanist idea of decline and fall. At this point, Volume 3 reaches, as it were, the major theme of the Machiavellian moment, to an extent that Pocock could describe this volume of Barbarism and Religion as a prequel to the Machiavellian moment. He was quite fond of these reversals. But what it meant was the theme of contingency. He was showing that the theme of contingency had been embedded in historical narrative as well as in Machiavellian political analysis. And in due course, this had created the historiographical conditions for the 18th century narratives of civil government. So there's a sense in which Volume 3 leads up to Volume 2. What those narratives confirmed was that historical contingency had definitively fragmented the Roman Empire into the several kingdoms, lesser principalities, and surviving republics of modern Europe, forming what Gibbon in his general observations would call one great republic, and Pocock would characterize as the Utrecht Enlightenment. There are two other forms, I think, of narrative, at least I draw attention to two other forms of narrative. One, qualified. The qualification applies to narratives of civil society. I think a phrase he does occasionally use. And this refers to sections in Volume 2 where he addresses the progress of civil society, is a section heading, and there's a chapter on the Scottish narrative. It's also present in Volume 4 where he discusses, after he's discussed the historiography of nomad barbarians, he moves on to the much more recently created category. It was a favourite point of Pocock that savages are modern. It's a modern category. These were assigned to the first stage of human existence. And of course, there's also in Volume 4 a discussion of Raynal, the Histoire des Deux Indes, as a history of commerce. But the point I want to make is the apparent complementarity of the categories of civil society and civil government is deceptive. For the history of civil society, as the Scots constructed it, was not a narrative like those of civil government. At best, it was, he calls it a macro-narrative or a meta-narrative. And he characterizes it as a natural or theoretical history, confirming the suggestion in the Machiavellian moment that it was closer to philosophy. And his point was that this, as it were, this philosophical historical argument was much less important to Gibbon than either Momigliano or Trevor Roper supposed. Another form of history which Momigliano thought Gibbon incapable of writing, and which Trevor Roper supposed that Gibbon meant to subvert, but which Pocock argued was integral to Gibbon's project, was sacred history, which Pocock defines in several places. What he means by this is the history of a monotheist God's interactions with his or its people. And in his case, the interest was on those interactions following the mission of Jesus Christ, and on the history of the church as the embodiment, the institutional embodiment of the yet-to-return Christ. And I continue to think, I've said this before, that I think one of the most original contributions of barbarism and religion is Pocock's argument that Gibbon, having initially in chapter 15 confined himself to explanations of the spread of Christianity within the empire without adducing the grounds for belief in its message, Gibbon realized as he began writing volume 2 that he must uncover those grounds if he was properly to understand the church's contribution to the empire and its decline. So to appreciate what Gibbon was doing, Pocock proceeded to devote volume 5 to identifying contexts for Gibbon's treatment of ecclesiastical history, finding them in both Catholic and Protestant source criticism and historical scholarship. And that made it clear that ecclesiastical history for Gibbon was not to be reduced, as it had been by Paolo Sarpi and his imitators, to a power struggle between bishops, popes, patriarchs, and secular rulers, but rather was to be narrated through its contested theology, which made it possible to understand why its leading figures, and above all Athanasius, had taken the positions they did. And it's here, obviously, that, and the passages in the handout show this, that Pocock saw himself breaking most completely from Trevor Roper. He put it more succinctly in a comment, not on the handout, in 2018, I could never understand why Trevor Roper, after bringing to light the connection between Laudianism and Enlightenment, refused to take religious doctrine seriously. The compulsions of wit, I suppose. It's in volume 6 of Barbarism and Religion that Gibbon finally focuses on Pocock finally focuses on Gibbon's construction of his own narratives. And volume 6 really is the volume that one needs to read. It's a chapter-by-chapter study, in effect, of volumes 2 and 3 of The Decline and Fall. And what Pocock shows is that Gibbon's conception of narrative was by no means as modern as even Momigliano supposed. On the contrary, it was authentically early modern. For the narratives Gibbon was writing in these volumes of The Decline and Fall were not so much his own, in other words, the kind of narratives that we all suppose narrative is since the 19th century, where it's the narrative the historian writes, as a rewriting of the narratives of his ancient sources, with source criticism applied to them in the footnotes. So for as long as possible, Gibbon adapted the narrative of Ammianus Marcellinus to recount the civil history of the empire. To explain waves of barbarian invaders, he could rely on De Guin. But it was much harder to make sense of the actions of the warlords who led the barbarians into the empire, Alaric, Genseric, Attila. No contemporary narrative provided Gibbon with a framework. There were much richer sources for sacred and ecclesiastical history. Tillemont from the Catholic side, also Fleury, Godefroy, Mosheim. And at the very end of volume 3, in chapter 38 of The Decline and Fall, on the Frankish monarchy, Gibbon had turned to the rival proponents, Colin alluded to this, the rival proponents of the rival French thèse nobiliaire and thèse royale, Boulainvilliers and Dubos, with Montesquieu in the role of arbiter between them. And at this point, one may observe, and I think Pocock was well aware, that the wheel had come almost full circle in his writing. He was back to where he'd started in the ancient constitution and the feudal law, with the encounter between Roman and customary law and the prehistory of the feudal law. Pocock also knew, though, that chapter 38 was the beginning of a move into new historical ground, the empire after its fall in the West, the ground of volumes 4 to 6 of The Decline and Fall. Pocock, he was by now, he's in his 90s, he realized, not even I am going to do this. But he also realized that he'd given himself the key to understanding these volumes. So even if he could no longer do the work himself, he would inform us what narratives we might expect to find in volumes 4 to 6. And he does that in the article Gibbon's Second Trilogy, which Richard published in History of European Ideas, and also in a typescript that Richard showed me, probably his last, the last work he wrote, I think, which thinks more about volume 4 of Gibbon and the relationship to 5 and 6. And the point Pocock makes here is that the key to understanding the second half of The Decline and Fall is to recognize that there was no central narrative for the Byzantine Empire. He couldn't draw on a central narrative, though Procopius supplied one for a while. Instead, Gibbon had to tell the empire's story through its appearances in narratives generated by the more vital and therefore historically conscious peoples and empires with which it had to interact. So no Byzantine narrative, but narratives available from Arabia, Asia, the Danube lands. But just one point here. There's one major topic in Gibbon's volume 4. This is a point for Caroline, really, which defied even Pocock's ability to identify relevant contexts. And that, of course, is the codification of Roman law carried out by Justinian, or under Justinian. This may reflect Gibbon's lack of interest in the historical possibilities of law rather than Pocock's. But it underlines the extent to which, in Barbarism and Religion, narratives have come to the fore at the expense of the history-generating potential of institutions. So there's a shift from the early writing. Anyway, I need to get towards a conclusion. I have one more point to make. But to sum up so far, I think I hope it's now clear that the intensity and persistence of Pocock's commitment to the history of historical writing, culminating in an examination of Gibbon's Decline and Fall, unprecedented in its scale and the range of its contextual reference, is undeniable. I mean, there it is. Pocock was justified in thinking that I and others had underestimated, that there hasn't been, I think, a full assessment of that achievement. That doesn't mean that political thought has disappeared from Barbarism and Religion. It's there. I would argue that the themes that I picked out in the article on Gibbon's Histories of Political Thought are very definitely culminate in Barbarism and Religion. And I'd add to that the normative political implication which Pocock attaches to Enlightenment, and that really becomes clear in Barbarism and Religion. Plural as Pocock's Enlightenments may be, Barbarism and Religion leaves no doubt which of the Enlightenment narratives he values most. And that's the subordination of any appeal to divine grace to the authority of civil government, the primacy of civil government over religious, the appeal to a direct communication with God. But that, the political and normative thought that is still present doesn't compromise, I think, the integrity of barbarism and religion as a work of historiography. An explanation of the writing of the decline and fall in multiple contexts. And the passage I quote from the letter of 2019, I think, sums that up very well. It's perfectly just. The histories of political thought and historiography coexist and contribute to one another in his work. I'm almost, but not quite at an end. I do want to make one final point, because there's a loose end, and it's quite a large one, and to some extent it comes back to Valerie's paper. And that is, it's something that puzzles me, and it's Pocock's argument, developed in lectures in Oxford, culminating in his contribution to the Hont Memorial volume in 2016, that the sovereign nation-state ought to be the primary subject of the narrative by which we constitute ourselves as a political self. Something very important, the political self, very important to Pocock. It's a claim that isn't incompatible with the articulation of subaltern narratives, and still less did Pocock wish the narrative of the state to cancel the oral mythologies of the non-scriptural culture of the New Zealand Maori. But even with those qualifications, this argument bound together political thought and historiography much more strictly than his other work. And it's puzzling in two respects. First, it gives priority to a pair of concepts, state and sovereignty, which are otherwise conspicuous by their rarity in Pocock's work. Those are Quentin Skinner's concepts. They're metaphysical concepts. They're not historical concepts, such as Pocock uses. I quote in the handout a letter of the 23rd of May where he says, "I see the Republic as a criticism of the state." Machiavellian moment at large. The second point is that Pocock was not only invoking concepts he otherwise avoided, he was categorizing under those heads political bodies which he was simultaneously demonstrating in barbarism and religion and in the discovery of islands were far from historical nation-states. The great Utrecht monarchies of France, Britain, Spain, and Austria were not nation-states. And if the United Kingdom was not, then whatever British condominium Pocock supposed that New Zealand had belonged to and was betrayed after 1945 was not a nation-state either. So what was this about? Well, I think it's a bit hard not to see it as a personal matter for him. One can see, and this helps to explain, but I don't think it removes the puzzle. In abruptly and quite late on in his career, insisting that the nation-state be at the center of the histories of our political selves, Pocock was making a claim much simpler than the richness of his scholarship warranted in the history of political thought or the history of historiography.
Okay, let's start. Our next speaker is Richard Whatmore, whom you all know. So Richard has not only written widely on the kinds of questions that are sort of central to John Pocock's work. He has also authored the introduction to the 2016 edition of The Machiavellian Moment, and he's also collecting the papers of intellectual historians, well, from sort of since the Second World War, really. So if you have any Pocockiana, please do send Richard a copy of those. He will be speaking now on Pocock and post-Utrecht Europe.
Thank you, Thomas. I should say thank you to Colin. I know people already have been saying thank you, Colin and Richard, but I've really done nothing. And it really is Colin who's done everything. So thank you. The other thing is that it's nice to go before Brian. I think it's probably 31 years since we were first appointed to Sussex together. And I've been following Brian ever since. And Brian was by far the senior person, and it's fitting that he goes second. But Brian's always interesting, and I thought by the time of this part of the day, I had to do something slightly different, because otherwise I'd bore people if I gave another interpretation of Pocock. So I'm only going to give one. I'm only going to make one interpretative point, and I'm going to do that at the end. What I'm going to do before then is to talk about Pocock as a letter writer, because he was just marvelous, and it didn't matter how complicated your early relationship might have been with him. And my relationship with Pocock started off badly. I did mention this the other day, because Felicity Pocock refused to get into my scruffy car and refused to allow me to ferry them around. And then I made a much bigger error, because I said the word John Hopkins instead of Johns Hopkins. And John Pocock boomed at me, "Johns Hopkins!" And I was really embarrassed. He then mistook me for Rob Iliff and sent me a series of letters about Newton, none of which I could answer. But gradually we got to know one another, and the marvelous thing about John, obviously there's 1,000 marvelous things, was that if you sent him something, then he'd comment on it, and he would helpfully ask you questions about what on earth you were doing and why had you done it in potentially the wrong way. And I'm going to give you an example of that in a bit, but I'm going to start with, and again it's connected to Brian, because we did this companion to intellectual history about, 2014, 2015. The thing about that, it was 40 chapters or something, and it's hell corralling authors, as everybody here knows. So the end result of that kind of companion volume, it was never going to be perfect. Anyway, when I sent it to John, he immediately noticed that we'd excluded anything at all on Istvan Hont. And he was really perplexed by this. And he wrote a letter, which actually dovetails with some of the things John Robertson's said. And this is what he wrote to me. Historiography, as most historians practice it, is the study of narratives, or rather the construction of them, without a consciously active theory or philosophy to situate them. And so, as multi-contextual and indeed multi-narrational as one finds oneself telling them, the history of historiography is therefore less, by which I don't mean never, the history of the theories or philosophies which have induced historians to choose their context and narratives, than the history of all or any of the inducements, evidential and cultural, which have led them to write the histories they did. It's a given that historians operate within contexts formed by the inducements to which they respond, and these contexts have their own histories. That, I think, is what I was trying to do with the Decline and Fall. Was I writing historismus or historiography? Am I a branch of intellectual history? It's a marvellous sentence. It seems, I'll continue because it was a great letter. It seems to follow that the intellectual history of any intellectual discipline, this is where he's starting to criticise the volume, especially one styling itself the history of a discipline, must be, or at any rate include, a history of its historiography. There is, God help us, a history of the historiography of the history of historiography. But nobody seems to have called for that, though I may have come dangerously close to doing so. There now arrives the question of how many intellectual histories so defined you have supplied in the companion. The Cambridge School has been a concept or fiction rather than an institutional reality. I rather wish the time had come, and may still come, for a historical narrative of what people associated with Cambridge have been doing for the last 60 or 70 years. This would begin with Forbes, a neglected figure, if not Figgis, and go on to Butterfield, Laslett, Pocock and Skinner-Dunn Pocock after that. Then you could have considered how the divergence between Skinner/Hobbes and Pocock/Harrington opens a path, not all of it at Cambridge, which could have been, and I think was, trodden by Hont. I see him as the most recent phase in the history of HPT at Cambridge and elsewhere, and his total absence from the text and index of the companion must be the result of a decision for which you had very good reason. No. Anyway, John Robertson referred to John Pocock's interest in Eurocentricity, and he made another point in the same letter, because he also raised the point of whether in the companion we had tried to avoid Eurocentricity, and by doing that we'd fallen into a trap, and that was he makes this criticism as follows. I imagine that pretty soon any companion to intellectual history will have to deal with the question of Eurocentricity, or rather with the question whether the intellectual history of a non-European culture can be written in terms congruent with or intelligible to those we are accustomed to using in our own. When the non-European culture is literate, the problem becomes one of translation. Words or whatnot will appear that seem to convey what we mean by political or whatever, and we shall have to decide what they mean and how we can relate them to the meanings we attribute to comparable words, concepts or images. I once tried that in English on what I understood certain texts in translation to be saying about politics in ancient China. The essay is in Politics, Language and Time, and nobody has written a word about it. Do you know Daniel Wolf's Global History of Historiography? The problem there is that there are certain words we translate as history, and we need to ask what they meant to Chinese or Arab people, and whether we ought to. The problem gets far worse when we're dealing with oral cultures, which turn out very sophisticated in ways we find highly unfamiliar. I've struck this in New Zealand Maori, where narratives apparently of past actions turn out not to be located in the past at all. How do you talk with Maori about them? Yet their sense is one of history, in the present. Unfortunately, we've, this is his criticism of the companion volume, become saddled with the global. Andrew Sartori's essay in Your Companion is a good example of how it works. You deny the existence in history of any language worlds persisting over time and focus exclusively on speech acts which pass from one world to another, as if there could be a bridge without two ends to it. The result is a history in which there are networks but no communities, and the historian becomes the ideologue of social media. It's going to be hard work getting rid of this. In the past, I mean. In the present, it may be beyond saving. So, John's was very critical, but he was also critical of me personally, and I don't really like doing this, but I'm going to get one of my props out. And John, this book, it's been in my garage. It's been nibbled by a mouse, which says something about it. And John called this book, obviously it's called Terra Sanctus, probably, he called it tar. Now, he called it tar, and it was typical of John, that he called it tar because he thought the argument was opaque, right? And I hadn't got things right. And did he tell me? He certainly did. And I just want to quote from this, and this is dealing with the subject which I'm supposed to be talking about, which John Robertson's also referred to, which is about what happens post-Utrecht. And in this book, I talk about the end of Enlightenment, and the version of the end of Enlightenment that I outline, John thought was just terrible. And I'm going to explain why. Geneva interests me less than Lausanne or Bern because I'm more interested in Arminian Enlightenment than in a possible Rousseau-esque variety. I'm building my narrative around Gibbon rather than Rousseau. But why was it that Vergennes, French foreign minister who intervenes in Geneva, invades Geneva with French troops and Swiss troops in 1782, why was it that Vergennes was forcing a republic to revert to oligarchy in Europe at the same time as he was promoting a republic in America? Note that Raynal and Diderot, who were working for Vergennes at the time, as I say in Barbarism and Religion 4, were asking why the United States of America, or whether it would turn out to be a weak Greek league or an expansive Roman republic. And they were wondering whether either would be in French interests. Is there a broad ideological picture of what Vergennes was up to? You seem to make his Genevan intervention symptomatic of an end of enlightenment by suggesting there was an enlightened state system according to whose rules big states weren't supposed to oppress smaller ones and monarchies weren't supposed to repress republics. I'm not at all sure of this. If you see it from Westphalia to Utrecht, you can see it originating with the dual objective of guaranteeing Europe against 1, renewed religious warfare, 2, universal monarchy, by means of an Anglo-French-Austrian deal from which the Dutch are firmly shut out because there's no suggestion of republics needing protection or threatening disruption, except, of course, in English historical memory. So, with what significance did Vergennes act against the Genevans? Meanwhile, the Utrecht States' order of peaceable relations between mainly monarchical states finds its historical justification in the rise of commerce and its religions in a richly Arminian Trinitarianism capable of Socinian leanings, in which sociability takes the place of grace and Christ's humanity increases relative to his divinity. This is my conservative enlightenment, which is going to be assailed before and during the revolution, but I don't speak of an end of enlightenment because I see both its attackers and its defenders as enlightened in different senses of the word as we use it in tracing history from Utrecht to a terminus not yet reached in this analysis. In other words, we don't have an end, but a series of crises within enlightenment, or as I'd prefer to say, among enlightenments, according to different uses of the word, which is ours more than it was theirs. Now the really critical bit. All this is well enough known to you. I'm a bit puzzled why you're still using the end phraseology. There's a lot more criticism I'm going to miss out. But he finishes. Your end of enlightenment turns upon Napoleon's transformation of republic into empire, which you see as a welcome relief from republican terror inspired by enthusiasm. Here was a history already known, distinct from Burke's apocalyptic vision of something utterly new. I don't think that this has figured so far in Tar, or that Geneva and Ireland were its birthplaces. I see it as an enthusiasm born of two previous enlightenments. One, the venture beyond Socinianism into radical enlightenment, there were several of these, in which the mind criticizing the idea of God sees itself as God, or the inhabitant of a world already one with him. The other is the product of the transformation of property into credit, which permits the mind to break free from all property's disciplines. Burke, who sees this happening with the Bavarian Illuminati and the revolutionary confiscation of the goods of the French Church. You thus get a republic more expansive than the Roman because there are literally no restraints it recognizes. Is it with us still? Question mark. I'll just finish. This republic suffers the fate of Rome and is turned into an empire. But even if it ceases to be enthusiastic, Napoleon as the greatest man since Christ, it's not a reversion to the old regime, but to the universal monarchy, to resist which was the purpose of one of the Enlightenments. It's the Shelburnes and Foxes who oppose wars against it, as they've been opposing wars for 100 years. But the prophecy that British trade and society will break down under the burdens of debt and corruption isn't fulfilled, and they defeat Napoleon by the greatest smuggling operation in history, flooding Europe with British goods in British-approved bottoms, that's obviously ships, in spite of the Berlin decrees, until he has to go to war in Spain and Russia to enforce them. That's a wild way of putting it, but it makes my point that there isn't an end of enlightenment, but a series of crises within a number of enlightenments, during which it is possible to say that some survive and some don't. In 1815, they gather at Versailles to restore a comity of states, and how they get on with it is for historians of the 19th and 20th centuries. I suppose I see the end of enlightenment as the advent of romantic nationalism and German historicism. Were these forms of enthusiasm? I have to say, so he was really critical of tar. He was much more positive about that, but, which he read several times, and I had to revise it, and then he'd tell me what was wrong. And, but I'm not going to talk about that. How long have I got now? 5 minutes. So, the thing was, with John, that this remarkable mind of his translated into commentaries on contemporary politics that were expressed in correspondence just terrific. And I'm going to quote from a couple of letters to Andrew Sharp, his very close friend, the New Zealand historian. This is from 2013, because you get a sense of actually the application of the history to the present. I wonder how the conference on traditions went. To me, the striking and encouraging thing is that you, and presumably the conference at large, presuppose the Pakeha as well as the Maori to constitute a community continuous enough to have a tradition at all. I get so much from people who interpret globalization as meaning that we all are, or all are becoming, hybridized to the extent to which we can only have traditions by inventing them. And that inventing is the first step on the road to paranoia. Did you get none of this in Wellington? Of course, such a diagnosis is encouraged by the current state of Republican politics, he's writing in 2013, where the peoples, and he's talking about the United States, the peoples who feel tradition in their bones, the American Pakeha in short, are the old white populations, and their traditions are largely populist fantasies about guns and God. They're getting beaten at the moment, 2013, but it'll be a while before they disappear. One can't but sympathise with them as the world is being changed by new liberalisms and new kinds of immigrant. Given that New Zealand has never been an immigrant culture of the American kind, I wonder whether there have been no signs of it happening there. Maori and Pakeha teaming up against an influx of Asians, for instance. In another letter, I'll just quote very, very quickly. I find the climate of global populism, it's 2016, depressing, as it seems to indicate that the credit economy is succeeding at depriving the political community of meaning. I've been writing an essay for a symposium on the 40th anniversary of the Machiavellian moment, in which I accord prophetic status to David Hume's 1752 dictum that either the nation will destroy public credit or public credit will destroy the nation. It certainly wants to. This is, follows the quote that John's already referred to that I used the other day as well at the Hopkins event. I've never been a United Kingdom voter, and I don't quite know how I would have voted on Brexit. On the one hand, I find the whole EU project philosophically objectionable. On the other, perhaps Britain and Germany should stand together against the Putinization of Eastern Europe. I'm thinking of writing a post-Gibbonian essay arguing that we've never got the latter's history, the Putinization of Eastern Europe, right. I don't think the British gave a damn about us, New Zealand, once they ceased to be a world power. We keep that identity for our own reasons, monarchy included. So you had a sense of concern that some of the worries of the 18th century were replicating themselves in the present, and a lot of fears, especially of our politics, never go away. And it just makes me return finally in the last 30 seconds that I've got to something that Colin began the day with that I think is absolutely right, and that is the impact on John Pocock of, at the age of 15, going to Karl Popper's lectures that became the Open Society and its enemies, and this meeting with Enoch Powell, where Powell is horrible about Popper, and actually the letter that he sent to me says, Powell, then Professor of Greek at Sydney, told us there would shortly be a war, this is early 1939, which we knew, and that in it he would rise to the rank of brigadier, which he did. He was so poisonously offensive to Karl Popper, then at Canterbury, that my father, not a man of liberal opinions, Colin's always said that, took him to task for offending against the laws of hospitality. And I think that John can be fitted into the context of the diaspora, the people who flee the fascists. Obviously, John himself wasn't part of that diaspora, but people like Popper, lots of people whose papers we've got here, Jakob Peter Meyer, but Talmon, people who then write the history of enlightenment. Peter Gay is another example in the 1950s, and so many of them are Anglophiles, and they look, as Popper did, you know, who do you blame? Plato, Hegel and Marx. Who did Talmon blame? Rousseau and the French revolutionaries, and Hayek at the same time is directly linking socialism to German thought, which then causes the catastrophes of the 20th century. And the problem becomes, what the hell went wrong with Britain? Because Britain was a force, and it's the state that takes in so many refugees, for moderation. So from the 18th century perception of Britain as a chaotic state that is itself fanatic and has had fanatic histories, in the 19th century it restores enlightenment in Pocock's sense, and in his lifetime he again, Popper's an example, he met with people who said, you need to work out why Britain managed in the 19th century to restore a version of enlightenment that had a beneficial effect on Europe and the world in terms of maintaining peace and some version of toleration, preventing the descent into fanaticism, and how you lost it in the 20th century. And obviously Pocock's not somebody who thought that Britain was an option anymore because it ceased to be a world power, and lots of these figures recognise that. Popper's the same, Hayek's the same, so many of the Anglophiles. But he's part of this Anglophile culture that then thinks it's so important to reflect on Britain and its history post-war. And, I mean, Colin's already done it typically, but I'll just say that's the right thing to do. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much. That was fantastic. It shows to what wonderful use you can put these archival materials. And our next speaker is Brian Young, who will give a paper on Pocock, Meinecke, and the Machiavellian moment.
The one problem with Richard's building me up is I can only disappoint, so I'm going to do it again. I remember that car. It was one of the few times in my life when I thought I ought to learn to drive, and I still haven't. So there we are. But the first quotation on the handout is the one I want you really to bear in mind throughout what I have to say. Self-knowledge is retrospective, and every author is his own owl of Minerva. A centenary invites us to historicize. A half-century invites us to contextualize. In 1924, the year of J.G.A. Pocock's birth, the 62-year-old Friedrich Meinecke published a lengthy study Die Idée des Staats Raison, an influential and exhaustive survey of Machiavellian raison d'etat, from its Florentine origins to a stark moment in Meineker's own long political lifetime, evoked thus. On the 9th of November 1918, the spark of German raison d'etat leapt over, of necessity, from the monarchy to the Republic. Anxiety about the future of the Weimar Republic haunted the hitherto profoundly conservative historian, who had only 11 years before that date celebrated as progress the story of how the Enlightenment cosmopolitan conception had evolved into the 19th century national state. 51 years after the publication in Munich of Die Idée des Staats Raison, Pocock published The Machiavellian Moment in 1975 with Princeton University Press. Despite the serendipity of this chronological coincidence, Meineker is never once mentioned or even alluded to in Pocock's extensive study of civic humanism. What is all the odder is that, in common with Pocock, Meineker long saw the necessary intertwining of the history of political thought with that of historiography, a fact of which Pocock was not innocent. Meineker became the leading historian of historicism as well as its last practitioner. Pocock, a master of contextualism, including the various contexts of what he called historicism. For Pocock, but crudely, if efficiently, perhaps even profoundly, historicism was a description to describe what it was to think historically. He was usually, however, indirect about the explicitly German origins and nature of historicism over the course of the long 19th century. Why was this? Any answer to this question takes us into the thickets of methodological controversy, but also into a series of contexts. When Meineker was writing complex studies in Ideengeschichte, English scholars were writing histories of scholarship that were almost periodically innocent of any sense of the need of laying down theoretical foundations. On the eve of war in 1939, David Douglas, closing his still useful study of English scholars, 1660 to 1730, proudly declared, and you will there see the usual self-parody of the English not being interested in method and all the rest of it. Such self-congratulatory assertions of confident, if naive, empiricism did not prove unique to English-born English scholars. It would be repeated by G.R. Elton, an émigré historian who became Regius Professor of History at Cambridge and whose observations on historical method would in turn be eviscerated by Quentin Skinner, although Elton had his reasons to adopt such bluff, as what Douglas went on to observe made clear in his celebration of the scholars whose lives he had recovered from 2 centuries of condescension. And that's when he refers to the book burnings and worse that had been going on in Germany before 1939. German historians, by contrast, were enmeshed in theory, usually having studied some philosophy alongside or as part of their historical training. This was especially true of Meineker, and hence perhaps some of the difficulties facing his reception in Britain. His post-war reputation in Germany likewise went through a long period of decline, especially from the 1960s to around 2006, when a volume of essays appeared edited by Gisela Bock and Daniel Schoenflug, which did something to rehabilitate his reputation, and the highly positive re-evaluation is marked in a recent study by a young Dutch scholar, Robert Kroll, significantly entitled Germany's Conscience, which the author translated into English in 2021. Such revision has always to be read alongside the contemporaneous reputations of the subjects so analysed, and Meineker's reputation when Pocock was beginning to work on historiography was decidedly compromised. He was seen as a metaphysician as much as an historian, wedded to historicism even after its period of crisis after 1914, and too conservative to separate his abhorrence of Nazi domestic policies from his admiration for German foreign policy. George Iggers, who was born in Hamburg in 1926, before moving as a boy with his Jewish family to America, had been particularly critical of Meineker in his 1968 study of the German conception of history. Herbert Butterfield acerbically reviewed the work in the English Historical Review in 1971, but the damage for Meineker's reputation had already been done. For all his acute understanding of the complexities of the varieties of conservatism, Meinecke was not someone Pocock, writing in the 1970s, was ever going to find sympathetic. Fascinated though he was by metaphysics, in common with many Anglophone historians, not least his beloved Edward Gibbon, Pocock had little taste for them other than as vagaries of the human intellect, the unexpected, often tragic impact of which it was the historian's duty to examine skeptically. Consider his critical distancing from early Christian theology in the introduction to Volume 5 of Barbarism and Religion. Readers, Christian or non-believing, who may find themselves involved in analyses of thought they considered obsolete or false, are asked to remember that they are studying the history of a time when such thinking was offered and read seriously. In our own time, when theism and atheism are once again in direct collision, this warning seems necessary. Pocock was interested in historiography, not in the philosophy of history. As with Gibbon, so with Pocock, Christian conceptions of history had themselves to be treated historically. Accordingly, the panentheism that permeated Meinecke's historical thinking was not something remotely of interest to him. It has been a methodological crux for some critics for over 40 years that the founders of the Cambridge School are insufficiently attentive to German approaches to intellectual history, especially Begriffsgeschichte, particularly as pioneered and practiced by Reinhard Koselleck, born the year before Pocock. But this is too superficial a reading. It is worth reminding ourselves that Cambridge intellectual history has its origin in the work at the turn of the 20th century of Figgis, and Figgis was deeply indebted to German historical writing, especially through the considerable scholarly enterprise of Maitland in translating a major work by von Gierke as Political Theories of the Middle Ages in 1900. Pocock's supervisor, Butterfield, likewise maintained his lifelong interest in German historical methods, and hence something of Pocock's mischief in identifying in the fraught relationship between the Whig interpretation of history of 1929 and the Englishman and his history of 1945, das Herbert-Butterfield Why and how, therefore, did a later generation of Cambridge historians turn away from recognizably German historical techniques, and with what consequences? To answer these questions, we must begin with Meinecke, an immediately post-historicist writer, the chief celebrant, intellectual heir, and later the solitary designated mourner of Ranke, the greatest exponent of historicism, whose chair at the University of Berlin he would subsequently occupy from 1914 to 32. For all his occasional appeals to cosmopolitanism, Meinecke was first and foremost a celebrant of German politics and history. Towards the end of his long life, he sought to atone for the various catastrophes of the 1930s and 1940s by calling for a new Goethe-Zeit. This was a professorial version of cosmopolitanism and a singularly evasive one. As he grew older, Koselleck rarely alluded to Meinecke, but on one occasion when he did, in an essay published in 1993, it was to chide him for having thus used Goethe to politically dubious purposes. Not quite the unpolitical man that a regretful Thomas Mann had declared of himself in his own brand of conservatism, Meinecke tended to conflate present politics and the reconciliations offered by history. Only a boy when the unification of Germany was achieved by his hero, Bismarck, he urged his compatriots to fight for the fatherland in the First World War in language that echoed Luther's prophetic tonality, albeit occasionally voiced in the chillier registers of the German professoriate. In this he was also aided by Hegel, about whom he was mostly ambivalent, but who was mutually praised by Meinecke in 1907 in curiously martial terms. Thus, a major representative of German philosophy finally gave war an unqualified and definitive sanction, and war received its place in a worldview that more than any before it sought to grasp the rational order of the world. In this he was contrasted with Kant's pacifism. Romanticism was more sympathetic to Meinecke than was Enlightenment cosmopolitanism. In defeat in 1918 he had to think again, and Meineker's first act of professional post-war atonement was to chart the long history of raison d'etat from Machiavelli to the end of what was for him the decidedly German 19th century. From the confident charting of cosmopolitanism and the national state, his major work of 1907, which would subsequently elevate him from a chair at Freiburg to Ranke's chair in Berlin, Meineker ultimately retreated in the increasing complexity of the Weimar years to his altogether more equivocal history of Machiavellian raison d'etat, following the collapse of the 19th century state system in which a united Germany was a late but major component. Confined to Weimar, Meineker perhaps paradoxically achieved a genuinely cosmopolitan perspective in Machiavellism, taking an even more territory than Pocock charted in the Machiavellian moment, but necessarily spending a long time in German lands, where he analysed a series of perspectives through tracts and treatises produced by Pufendorf to those produced by Treitschke, taking in Frederick the Great, Hegel and Ranke along the way. These were lands and writings that Pocock never explored, despite the significance of Frederick the Great's celebrated tract Anti-Machiavel, in the composition of which he was aided by Voltaire, and the fact that the 7 Years' War played such a major role in the mutations of civic humanism in England and America that Pocock did so much to survey. The English-speaking Atlantic was usually a long way from continental Northern Europe in Pocock's political geography. It was also a long way from it philosophically. For Meineker, the laws of the universe and the duties of the historian were remarkably and problematically intertwined, and in this he was closer to Kant and idealism than to Hume and Anglo-Scottish scepticism, and to what Iggers called an unlikely fusion of Hegel and Ranke. These were varieties of Enlightenment and the immediate post-Enlightenment era to which Pocock was notably allergic. The Owl of Minerva is a favourite conceit in Pocock, but despite much use of the philosopher's favourite trope, Hegel is otherwise largely conspicuous by his absence in Pocock's writings. Pocock favoured such artificial, often classical imagery, deftly separating from Hegel's philosophy an image that was reconstituted and repurposed for history. Pocock's metaphors tend to be taken from artificial rather than natural sources. There is nothing like the sediments of time that concerned Koselleck and Pocock. The historical thought of the two men is very different, and Koselleck was closer here to Meineker, who favoured metaphors taken from nature, than one might otherwise expect of this critical student of Carl Schmitt. But Schmidt's Hobbes was a long way from the student of eschatology studied by Pocock in his contribution to a Festschrift for Butterfield. For Schmitt, Hobbes was an undying theoretician with whom it was one's duty to engage. For Pocock, Hobbes was an original exponent of the use of biblical and secular time, who subtly informed his own thinking as an historian of political thought. For Meineker, history and statecraft are deeply entwined in studying raison d'etat in his study of Machiavelli and his legacy, as he goes on to elaborate in a terse yet poetic manner, highly becoming in a student of Ranke, and that's the quotation about how raison d'etat prepared the way for modern historicism. Foucault once claimed that historicism originated in European theatres of war. Meineker would not necessarily have disagreed with him. Meineker's conception of intellectual history was, however, not so distant in every respect from that of Pocock, for all it was planted in different soil and assumed a pronouncedly greater structural stability over time. As Meineker declared his purpose in the genetic form of the history of ideas, each of the thinkers selected is, we hope, representative of his epoch. Machiavelli, Frederick the Great, and Hegel emerge as those who have simultaneously exerted a powerful influence on historical life. Is this so markedly different from what Pocock does with Machiavelli and Guicciardini, Harrington, Bolingbroke, Hamilton, Adams, and so many others? And in a rather commonplace study, The Statecraft of Machiavelli, published in 1940, Butterfield, a student of historiography, had strangely failed to mention Meineker, but he did explore the impact of Machiavelli on Bolingbroke, an issue Pocock developed in the Machiavellian moment. Pocock rarely trespassed beyond 1800, and the windswept landscape of Romanticism lovingly explored by Meineke. J.H. Hexter's witticism that when reading the Machiavellian moment, one would be ill-advised to try to hold one's breath until the moment passes, would equally well apply to accommodating Meineke's yet larger claim. The real theme of this book, therefore, is to examine the impact of the idea of raison d'etat on the various Weltanschauung and modes of intellectual thought, and to follow up the effects of this impact through the centuries of recent history. Even Pocock occasionally resorted to the barbarism that is mindset, but that ugly neologism is not exactly commensurate with the ambitions of the superbly, uniquely, intransigently untranslatable notion of Weltanschauung. Comprehensive apprehension of the world will not do as a translation. Untranslatability relates to institutions as well as to discourse. After all, cosmopolitan is not quite adequate as a translation of Weltbürgertum, the awkward locution of world citizenship being closer to the mark. And here significant differences between German and English political circumstances are fundamental, permitting Pocock to justify his non-Marxist account of the problematic standing of commerce in 18th century England. Discussing the rise of what he called 18th century sociology in England, Pocock measured the distance between classical and North European points of political reference. The polis and the burg or borough, were profoundly different places, and it is hard to overestimate the amount of confusion caused by the circumstance that the German word for citizen is Bürger. For Marx, the commercial was allied with the bourgeois. Citing his favourite clerical economist Josiah Tucker, Pocock notes that the 18th century Dean of Bristol uses no English equivalent for bourgeois because there is none, though Tucker did know that the borough civilised the barons of medieval England. Burke had been obliged to use the imported Dutch word burgers because he knew no bourgeoisie. They constituted for him a Swiftian moneyed interest in the revolutionary France Burke denounced. The suitably named James Burke, writing in the 1770s, was indeed one of the early English authors known to have used the term bourgeoisie, but he used it of the lesser gentry of Holland, and why he used a French word in denoting Dutch social categories is as puzzling as why Burke used the Dutch word burgers to denote the inhabitants of French towns, or who first used the word with reference to England. A purely lexical footnote in Pocock's seminal essay on Tucker is gravid with interpretive implication. Borg, bourgeois, bourgeois, adjective. Bourgeoisie, burg, burger, burgerlich, burgertum. Borough, burgess, no adjective, no collective or abstract noun. This exercise in historical semantics suggests further reflections. Pocock's tersely fertile footnote vastly complicates Meineke's thoroughly burgerlich conception of the Weltbürgertum. In history, we are all provincials, no matter how cosmopolitan we might fancy ourselves to be. Equally, it is quite impossible for the lexical gravity of that footnote to find a place in Kosellek's great enterprise, the geschichtliche Grundbegriffe. Even here, translation is not straightforward. Basic concepts of history is clumsily inadequate. Dictionaries are not histories, especially in one language for one country, and they cannot properly attend to discourses as they are practiced, as Pocock consistently insisted when participating in 1996 at a symposium celebrating the completion of Kosellek's 8-volume historical dictionary. And Koselleck was unashamedly committed to conventional categories drawn from social history. As a much more philosophical discipline of Ideengeschichte became understandably unfashionable in post-Second World War Germany, in which Meineke would live on for 9 years, dying in 1954, 5 years before Koselleck published the book that initially made his name in Germany. In Critique and Crisis, Koselleck employed the word bourgeois in collocations that would shock an historian of the Anglophone 18th century world. It is a monetary thought that Pocock's own first book, The Ancient Constitution of the Feudal Law, had only recently appeared in 1957. Occasionally citing Meineke's great work on raison d'etat, Koselleck moved his insights into rather different cultural registers. The English Civil War is stated to have seen the absolutist state undermined by a struggle for faith, which already betokened the bourgeois revolution. Hobbesian rationality took advantage of this in the early Enlightenment, but religion was to be inflected by bourgeois humanism inherited from the theologians. He examined the historical impact of Europe's international legal order for the self-comprehension of the nascent bourgeoisie. Vattel, writing during the 7 Years' War, took his stand on the borderline between bourgeois moral and state political arguments. Locke, whose complicated place in the history of political thought led Pocock to posit das second treatise problem, was introduced by Koselleck as the spiritual father to the bourgeois Enlightenment. According to Koselleck, Locke's writings furnished the justification for the English form of government as it had come to prevail since 1688 with the rise of the economically determined Whig bourgeoisie. Ironically, Koselleck wrote those words only shortly before Peter Laslitt's edition of the Two Treatises of Government demonstrated that Locke was writing before and not after the events of 1688-89, a founding move in Cambridge School contextual history, part of what Pocock has called the Laslettian moment. We are witnessing here a major difference in historical cultures, one that accelerated in the total eclipse of historicism, in the shadow of which Koselleck began his career, and the origins of which Meinecke magisterially chronicled in valedictory mood in Die Entstehung des Historismus in 1936, a year after resigning, facing pressure from the Nazis from the editorship of the Historische Zeitschrift. Meinecke's study proved to be his most lasting classic, one which, as R.V. Lifshitz has argued, had a profound effect on Isaiah Berlin, who provided a foreword to the 1972 translation. Crucially, this was the work by Meinecke that did matter to Pocock, who was fully aware of Berlin's indebtedness to it. He wrote in the second volume of Barbarism and Religion of Giarizzo's study of Gibbon that it was composed in the mighty shadows of Croce and Meinecke. Pocock wished in his own study of Gibbon to complicate a mainstream of European intellectual history running through Enlightenment to historicism. Denying that Gibbon could be seen in any way as a 19th century historicist, he made an elegantly epigrammatic contrast between Gibbon leaving Paris in 1763 and Herder doing the same in 1769. Herder departs in search of historicism, Gibbon of history. He writes history, not philosophy of history. We can now cross the Valhalla Bridge away from Germany back to America to witness Pocock's contrasting reaction to two further German writers, both of whom were emigres to the country where he himself spent the greater part of his long life. Leo Strauss and Hannah Arendt have both been seen as reacting in their different ways against the disappearance of historicism as a mode of understanding during the Weimar Republic. In the unwitting descent into something very like self-parody that constitutes his 1958 study Thoughts on Machiavelli, with its strange appeal to esoteric numerology and the idea that the true doctrines appear exactly halfway through philosophical texts only for those prepared to find them by initiation into the art of reading between the lines, Strauss nowhere appeals to Meinecke's major work in the field, although he does refer, both in the body of the text and much more frequently in notes at the end of the book, to many of the German language authors used by Meinecke in Machiavellism. Fichte, Ranke, and Burckhardt appear in the endnotes, Goethe in the chapter on Machiavelli's teaching as well as in endnotes. Nietzsche also appears, suitably confined to the notes, including an appeal to the arcane numerology adopted by Strauss in developing his technique of interlinear criticism. Assessing Nietzsche's assault on the Gospels, Strauss observed parenthetically and with patient glee, this assertion occurs in that section of the Antichrist, which by an amazing accident is the 33rd section. What, one wonders, would Nietzsche have made of that? The many excesses of Strauss's exegetical method are unwittingly exposed in Thoughts on Machiavelli, and hence something of the pleasure with which Pocock reported to Quentin Skinner his having awoken from a dream concerning the significance of a 13th chapter that would shock his Straussian opponents, and as revealed in a letter to Nicholas Phillipson, his delight in going beyond the original proposed 13 chapters of the Machiavellian moment. Pocock had much more respect for historicism, however understood, than he had for Strauss or his followers, whose misreading of Machiavelli particularly incensed him. Strauss's methodological contempt for historicism is evident in his declaration regarding Machiavelli and Hobbes in Thoughts on Machiavelli. That all these errors in the interpretation of the thinkers in question can be traced to a failure to grasp the parochial character of the 19th and 20th century outlook, which inevitably pretends to be wiser than that of any earlier age. So much for Meinecke's variant of historicism. As a German Jewish refugee, Strauss nonetheless had reasons to be suspicious of the dialectic between cosmopolitanism and the national state as expressed by the self-confessedly anti-Semitic Meinecke. Nor was Strauss alone in his suspicions of Meinecke, held by the German Jewish diaspora. Strauss's study of Machiavelli appeared 3 years after a major work produced in America by another such refugee, Hans Paron's The Crisis of the Early Italian Renaissance, which was fundamental to Pocock's Machiavellian moment, not least in allowing him to substitute the idea of civic humanism for that of classical republicanism. Despite having worked at the University of Chicago, where Strauss held Magus-like charismatic authority, Paron never mentioned him in his own work, either originally in 1955 or in its second revised edition in 1966. Nor yet did Paron, who had studied philosophy with Troeltsch at Berlin, mention Meinecke. But he did mention a greater historian with something akin to reverence, as he noted the cool-headed, matter-of-fact acceptance of apparent necessities destined to become one of the characteristics of Machiavelli's and Giorgiardini's objective analysis of political conditions, a feature which since Burckhardt has been brought into such sharp relief by students of the Renaissance. In Machiavellism, Meinecke was ambivalent about Burckhardt and what he called his tragic pessimism, coolly identifying him as an independent historical thinker, while citing approvingly the Swiss historian's suspicions of the people as being just as capable of warmongering as old political elites. Burckhardt's influence was profoundly felt not only by Baron, but also by Paul Oscar Christella, both rightly praised by Hexter as the heroes of the rehabilitation of the hard-pressed Renaissance. And Hexter went on to observe that the importance of historical work like that of Baron and Christella tends to be underestimated by the professoriate. Characteristically, Pocock did not use Christella, who was an historian of philosophy in the Machiavellian moment, but he did appeal to Baron, primarily a cultural and literary historian from whom he learnt much, and whose presence numinously, if controversially, could be felt over the whole scene. And then you'll see the quotation from Baron in which he makes a comparison between the assault of the Visconti on Florence in 1402 with the failure of Napoleon and Hitler to get across the English Channel, which reads like an inversion of Meinecke, and even given its presentation in another language, has something of the perilously grandiloquent rhythm of Meinecke's prose. But Meinecke would have hated the implied parallel, and it was clear from his writings that he did not greatly care either for England or for the English. Pocock preferred intellectual and cultural historians such as Baron to students of political thought in charting the Machiavellian moment, another being Nikolai Rubinstein. He greatly admired the English face of Machiavelli, the work of a fellow Antipodean, Felix Raab, who died young and came from a German Jewish émigré family. What Pocock critically called in 1989 my own culture of Australia, New Zealand and the United Kingdom was itself increasingly cosmopolitan, and he was suitably conscious of being a recent settler in an ancient culture. One of Pocock's justly most admired Jewish émigré historians was Felix Gilbert, a pupil of Meinecke who had also fetched up in America. Gilbert's terse and tetchy sketch of his quondam mentor, contributed to the translation of Weltbürgertum und Nationalstaat, was a concentrated masterpiece of personal ambivalence and scholarly ambiguity. Never has the evocation of intensely cold eyes ever been more chilling, especially eyes that chose to lose focus when speaking with such students as Felix Gilbert. Gilbert simultaneously owed everything and nothing to Meinecke. An essay he wrote on Machiavellism did nonetheless recommend the classic work on the subject by his former Berlin professor. Pocock's debts to historians, especially émigré scholars, were always minutely acknowledged. He was, however, much more reluctant to acknowledge another debt. It is only 2 pages before the end of the Machiavellian moment that he noted the one admittedly immense debt he owed to the leading social and political theorist of the post-war Jewish intellectual diaspora, that is, Hannah Arendt. Why was this? Was the debt perhaps too great to admit? Was he too suspicious of social theory? Did Arendt offer something suspiciously like a philosophy of history? Had she been too close to Heidegger for Pocock's taste? A ready recourse to all too routine academic sexism to explain this fleetingly capacious acknowledgement will in this instance simply not do. His long essay on varieties of Whiggism was dedicated to Caroline Robbins, and unlike some advocates of republicanism as a living heritage, he was open about the heavily gendered language, often bordering on misogyny, which compromised it, from Machiavelli's conception of Fortuna onwards. As the classically educated Pocock phrased it, Pandora came before Prometheus. To pursue passions and to be victimized by them was traditionally seen as a female role, or as one which subjected masculine virtue to feminine fortuna. Similarly, he was exercised by the sexist implications of the many fantasies of speculation and accumulation that accompanied much of the writings of such apologists for the financial revolution as Joseph Addison. And Arendt returned to significance for Pocock's non-Marxist account of the rise of commerce in Augustan England in his 1981 essay, Virtues, Rights and Manners. Arendt's was but one name that could populate a footnote that distances Pocock from the all too frequently homosocial aspects of the field in which he worked. In writing of the authors in the history of political discourse, most of whom were men, I am unembarrassed to find myself using the masculine pronoun, but when it comes to the authors of that history, a host of distinguished names occur to remind me that it might just as well have been the feminine. A curious footnote regarding his minor obsession with Josiah Tucker was constructed in this mode. He was one of those insignificant Englishmen of whom the history of political thought so largely consists. This remark is dedicated with irritated affection to Judith Sklar. By listening to a plurality of voices using a plurality of discourses, Pocock opened a wider world than any analysed by Meinecke. The second half of Machiavellism is largely occupied by the same German thinkers as previously populated the territories surveyed in Cosmopolitanism and the National State, and after initially analysing Machiavelli, the first half is taken up by chapters devoted to Baudin, Botero, Boccalini, Campanella, Grotius, Spinoza, the usual suspects. This is a strange hybrid of the history of ideas and the history of diplomacy. His solitary English thinker is Hobbes, and he is hardly insignificant. Meinecke had absolutely no interest in insignificant people, English or otherwise. He contemptuously dismissed any attempt to write a literary history of the impact of Machiavelli as, in the process, one would have to cross swords with a host of third and fourth-rate minds. Ideengeschichte was usually given over entirely to great thinkers as they supposedly structured titanic ideologies, thereby missing altogether the more permissive and necessarily plural words of intellectual histories of competing and overlapping discourses. Such judgmentalism of the stature of thinkers and writers is rare in Pocock, and no small part of the appeal of Edmund Burke to him was that he was a figure of many complexities. This was the sense of the plurality of tradition that motivated Pocock as an historical thinker. Accordingly, he had little time for grand narratives of the kind promoted by Meinecke. Similarly, he questioned the would-be cosmopolitanism of Koselleck's conception of time. Pocock emphasized that Professor Koselleck is writing about German history and I about British. Any disinterested examination of what Koselleck had to say about specifically modern concepts and experiences of time would discover that his own conception of time, suffused as it is with his own experience as a prisoner of war who had only just survived to return home, is recognizably German in character. When he tried to counter Pocock's conception of discourse by pointing to historical subjects who regularly used two languages, he provocatively chose to illustrate it thus. Even in battle, Frederick II of Prussia thought in French but issued commands in German. His notion of a settled site between late early modernity and modernity can be understood as taking one from what Kant called the age of Frederick to the Vormärz, in which post-Napoleonic German states confronted internal tensions up to and including 1848. And Pocock was not being satirical when he had offered his claim at conferences in DC that Britain between 1789 and 1848 passed through a settled site and entered a new modernity. For all the difference between the texture of their thought and writings, much that they had to say was not radically dissimilar. But it is imperative in understanding the radical separation that subsisted between them that Koselleck continued to deploy language drawn from social history. Where Koselleck appealed to structure, Pocock preferred to emphasize agency, and that is bound to affect the way an historian reads texts. Locke, contra Koselleck, was not an early spokesman for the bourgeoisie, but what he was, that Pocock always insisted, is not obvious. Similarly, the apparently insignificant can be historically significant, and hence the attraction to Pocock of that admirable 18th century curmudgeon Josiah Tucker. And therein lies the continuing twin challenge and reward for the practice of contextual intellectual history, complexity and plurality. This paper took it as epigraph Pocock slyly evoking Hegel in his introductory essay on the state of the art published in 1985. It is even more appropriate to end with him appealing in the same essay to the witness of two languages with which he was much more familiar than he was with Hegel's German in all its manifestations. Italian usage may be wise in calling an author's posthumous work his fortuna, French in calling it his travail. It is important to end on one of Pocock's many paradoxes as we work out whether we close today's considerations on his work and legacy as fortuna or travail. We should heed Pocock's words about Felix Raab, who died prematurely, and apply them to Pocock, who died peacefully at the age of 99. He loved and lived by debate and argument, and to debate, even to argue with him beyond death, is to prolong his life.
Thank you so much. That was what a splendid conclusion.